Today's hearing will come to order. Today we're going to focus on cost and impact of the utility MACT rule, or as EPA prefers to call it, the Mercury and Air Toxics Standard. When the President was a candidate for the office he now holds, he attended a meeting in San Francisco, a fundraiser. And at that fundraiser, he made the comment that we will bankrupt the coal industry in America. While his administration was unsuccessful in passing the cap-and-trade legislation, the President was quoted after that failure saying that there's more than one way to skin a cat. And he was right, because EPA did become the lead agency to significantly damage the coal industry in America, the industry that provides the base load for electricity in this country. And when I talk about the coal industry, I'm talking about the coal mining industry, yes. I'm talking about utilities that burn coal as well. And with this new rule, EPA has made it very clear that in this area, they're not concerned about, they're not setting environmental policy, they're setting energy policy for America. And more than one expert in the field has said that the stringency of the new unit electric generating units that use coal standard means that under this rule, not one new coal-fired plant can be built and meet these standards, because no one can get a warranty which is necessary to get the financing to build a unit because of the Franken plant standard that EPA is using. Now, the sad thing about it is, when we ask about the cost of this regulation, EPA gives us no cost. In fact, they made the comment that that's not useful. But they did go out to the year 2016, and they said that in 2016 that this would cost $9.6 billion that year. And of course, that's calculated about you borrow the money to meet these requirements, and the payment on that year will be $9.6 billion. But we've repeatedly asked, we've sent questions, we've sent letters, we've called, asking for the total cost. And we still have no total cost. And we know that this is the most costly regulation relating to utilities that EPA has ever submitted. And the sad thing about it is they did not even look at the cost of lost jobs. They said that the total gigawatts lost as a result of this regulation be 4.6 gigawatts. And one company, First Energy, has announced in the last few days the closure of plants that equals 3.7 gigawatts from one company. So I think EPA is misleading the American people, and deliberately so. Because when they talk about this regulation, all they talk about is mercury, the importance of reducing mercury and acid gases and non-metallic components. And yet when they did the benefit analysis of this rule, all of the benefits, with the exception of a very minute amount, comes from particulate matter, which was never even set out as a purpose of this regulation, to reduce particulate matter. Everyone you'll hear today will talk about, the mercury and the how important it is we reduce that, and the benefits from that are minute. And I would just like to put on the slide real quick. The total global mercury emissions around the world are about 7,300 to 8,300 tons per year. And about 70% of that is natural. And U.S. utilities each year, out of that 8,300 tons per year worldwide, provides 29 tons of emissions of mercury. And the total benefit from this new regulation and reductions of mercury emissions in the U.S. will be about 20 tons per year out of 8,300 worldwide. So I'm quite disappointed in this regulation. It's going to have profound impact in a negative way on the American people and their ability to compete in the global marketplace. This time I'd like to recognize for an opening statement the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Waxman of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the first 20 years after the Clean Air Act was enacted in 1970, visible air pollution decreased substantially. But we made very little progress on reducing toxic air pollution, the invisible heavy metals and other chemicals that cause cancer, brain damage, birth defects, and other devastating health problems. In the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, adopted by an overwhelming bipartisan majority on this committee, we addressed this issue. The new law directed EPA to set standards requiring industrial sources to use available pollution control technology to reduce their emissions of mercury, arsenic, and other toxic air pollution. Since 1990, EPA has adopted standards for almost every major industrial source of toxic air pollution. Every source, that is, except power plants, which emit more mercury than any other source. Owners of the dirtiest power plants have used political and legal tactics to block standards requiring them to clean up their pollution. When forced to act, the Bush administration issued weak standards for power plants that were scientifically and legally indefensible. The courts ultimately threw them out, forcing EPA back to the drawing boards. Finally, in December, after more than 20 years of study, litigation, and delay, EPA issued strong but achievable standards to cut toxic air pollution from America's dirtiest power plants. These new standards will cut emissions of toxic mercury by 90%. This is a major step forward. Exposure to mercury can damage the nervous system of infants and children, which can impair their ability to think and learn. We should be cheering this good news, but instead we're holding this hearing to criticize EPA for protecting the health of our children. Last year, the committee and House Republicans even voted to block EPA from acting. I think this committee has its priorities exactly backwards. We should be standing up for the health of infants and children, not the powerful coal and utility industries. These new standards will have tremendous health benefits. By cutting emissions of pollution that trigger asthma attacks and damages babies' brains, we could see up to $90 billion in health benefits every year. $90 billion in health benefits every year. These benefits far outweigh the costs of implementing these long overdue achievable pollution controls. Now, we'll hear from members today that these health benefits aren't real. But as you evaluate these claims, remember that some of the members who voted to deny that climate change is real will be making these claims. We need to be guided by science. EPA's findings are supported by reams of peer-reviewed science on the health impacts of mercury and fine particles, including work by the independent EPA Science Advisory Board and the National Academy of Sciences. I'm concerned about what's happening in this committee. Science denial should have no place in Congress. It's reckless and it's dangerous. If members have questions about our scientific understanding of air pollution and its health effects, bring in the researchers, bring in the experts, and examine the peer-reviewed scientific literature. The last 40 years prove we can have both economic growth and a cleaner environment. We do not have to choose between jobs and toxic mercury pollution that endangers our children's brains. In fact, requiring power plants to invest capital and install modern pollution controls will create jobs. Fabricators and factory workers build the pollution controls, construction workers install them on the site, and skilled employees operate them. EPA says its rule will create 46,000 short-term construction jobs and 8,000 long-term utility jobs. The EPA, that's even more than the XL pipeline will create in terms of jobs. The EPA rule will save American lives, protect our children from brain damage, clean up old polluting power plants, and even create jobs. I congratulate President Obama, Administrator Jackson, Assistant Administrator McCarthy, and the hardworking staff at EPA for finally getting the job done. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Whitfield. Thank you, Ms. McCarthy, for once again coming before us. I have a prepared statement, and it's a very good prepared statement. I'm going to put it in the record, but I'm going to speak a little bit extemporaneously because I think this is a very important hearing. This utility MACT rule is the most expensive regulation that's ever been proposed on the American economy, as far as I can tell. The annual estimated cost for the first 5 years is approximately $10 billion a year. It's estimated that by 2020 we're going to have a loss of about 1.5 million jobs. And the question is, what are the benefits? Now, as you know, myself and others have sent a number of letters to you and the administrator, Mrs. Jackson, asking to try to flesh out these so-called benefits, these avoidable deaths and things of that sort. Mr. Waxman alluded to that in his opening statement. I have a letter that you that you signed to me. We received it 3 days ago, and it's the most extensive effort yet to try to comply with our request. So I want to give you a pat on the back for that. I've read it twice, and I honestly can tell you that I don't think you've told me anything. I think that we keep referring to these studies and these models. There's no real factual data in this response anywhere where they've gone out and done an emergency room study near a power plant and compared it to somebody who lives in Yosemite National Park or something. I mean, you go from wherever you think the dirtiest areas, wherever you think the cleanest areas, compare those over time, get a baseline for what the ambient environmental issues are, and then compare them. And these are all models based on assumptions, and they're written in a way that the average person's eyes just glaze over. Now, I'm going to keep trying. I'm going to keep trying to understand it, and I'm going to ask some people that are a lot smarter than me to take a look at it. But when Mr. Waxman said in his opening statement that these regulations could create 46,000 jobs, that's in this report that you put out with the ruling. And I looked at that, and when you delve down into it, it's because of the increased jobs created to comply with the rule. Now, the more regulation you have, the more compliance costs you're going to have, but you're going to have to hire people, but they don't produce anything. If I go out and hire a coal miner and he digs an additional ton of coal a day, and that coal is burned to create electricity, there is a product is developed that is saleable and that somebody uses. If I hire another compliance officer, he sits there and shuffles paperwork all day. Now, if the answer to our economic problem is more regulation so that we get more people hired for compliance, we could go out and start hiring people to go rob banks, so they'd have to hire more bank guards to protect against the bank robbers. You'd create jobs, but you'd shut the bank down. And, Madam Administrator, I'm afraid that's what we're doing right here. So I look forward to an honest debate. You're always honest in your answers. I appreciate that. But we have a fundamental disagreement about the result, and we hope to elaborate on that later. With that, I want to yield to Mr. Pompeo the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Barton. You know, we'll hear a lot about studies and reports and data today, but we don't have to go very far from where I live to see the real-world impact of this rule. In Kansas, we've been trying to build a coal-fired power plant called Holcomb 2 for an awfully long time. It's been stopped by our former governor, now Secretary of HHS, through litigation. And this is a clean coal-fired power plant. This is a power plant that I would think environmentalists would advocate. We'll retire some older coal. This is a good step forward, and yet under the existing Utility MACT, I'm anxious to talk to Secretary McCarthy today about how we're going to build that plant. I don't think it's possible. The company certainly doesn't. It hasn't been able to move forward with this for many, many years now. So I'm anxious to learn how under this new set of rules we can begin to continue to build coal-fired power plants in America. I think the Utility MACT rule is designed to create costs which prohibit that and isn't about good environmental policy, but instead is about energy policy, trying to drive coal out as an affordable source for manufacturers and consumers all across the country. With that, I yield back to Mr. Barton.
Gentleman's time has expired. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, we're here today to hold yet another debate in a long series of subcommittee hearings on the costs associated with implementing the EPA's Utility MACT rules. And I'm curious to see if we hear anything new or different from what we've already learned from the numerous hearings on this issue in the past. Mr. Chairman, I don't know, I feel a sense of serious schizophrenia kind of settling in on this committee because we've already passed the Train Act to delay the rules, and with the majority's votes, now we're saying, well, now that they're delayed, let's study it more. Let's look at the cost. And Mr. Chairman, in all the hearings that we've had in the past, we've heard industry say that implementing these Utility MACT rules will raise prices for everyone involved, and they advocate stalling and delaying these rules for 5 or 10 or 20 more years down the road in order to give themselves more time to plan and prepare for the new standards. Mr. Chairman, this schizophrenia in this committee, yesterday we were saying let's hurry up and pass the legislation to force the administration to, within 30 days, to approve the XL Keystone Pipeline. And now today, 24 hours later, we're saying, let's stop, let's wait, hold up. It reminds me of when I was in the service. Hurry up and wait. You were always running from here to there, running to the mess hall, running to this and running, and then you always had to wait in line. Let's hurry up and wait. So what we are doing here is, yesterday we were hurrying up, and today we're saying, let's wait. And those who subscribe to this hurry up and wait tactic say that because many in the industry are not prepared for these new rules, they will have to shut down many old plants and spend money investing in retrofits and upgrades so they will be in compliance with the new MACT rules. Mr. Chairman, these folks have had years and years and years to prepare for these new rules. I'm as sensitive to the issue of higher energy costs as anyone on the subcommittee. My constituents that I represent will suffer disproportionately when their heat and energy bills eat up a larger share of their hard-earned paycheck. But I believe it's a cop-out that we should scrap or to delay these new EPA rules and give those who've been caught flat-footed more time to catch up to their more forward-thinking industry counterparts. Again, Mr. Chairman, my utility, Commonwealth Edison, Exelon, my utility, they've already retrofitted their plants. They've invested over $1 billion. They were out in front of this. Now you're telling them that they didn't have to invest all that money and they didn't have to take a very progressive and forward view. You're telling my constituents that what has happened is meaningless. Mr. Chairman, I think that these companies who did not take see the writing on the wall, did not take this Congress seriously, did not take the work of this committee seriously, and decided that at the end of the day they were going to kind of try to manipulate the American people and manipulate this committee so that they have even more time, 10, 20 years, to do something that's common sense and that is in the interest of the American people. I think that, Mr. Chairman, it's time for us now to try to deal. First of all, we've got to admit that we are a schizophrenic committee or subcommittee. And once we admit that we got a problem, then we can get some help to try, an intervention to try to solve the problem. So let's, Mr. Chairman, I think this is a useless subcommittee, and I'm glad that the administrator is here. But frankly, Ms. McCarthy, I think you have much more important work to do than to sit here and entertain us with the same old question, the same old rigmarole, the same old game. You got the American people need you to be over doing your real work and not here entertaining us. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Rush. Is there a psychiatrist in attendance this morning in the audience somewhere? Well, we have one person on the first panel this morning, and that's the Honorable Gina McCarthy, who's the Assistant Administrator for Air and Radiation, U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Ms. McCarthy, thank you for joining us again today. We appreciate your taking time to come and talk about utility MACT, or mercury, or MATS, as you all call it. And you're recognized for a period of 5 minutes, and at the end of that time, then we'll go into a question and answer period. So you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, members of the committee. I really appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today. Last December, EPA finalized the Mercury and Air Toxic Standards, MATS. These standards, required by the Clean Air Act, are the first national standards to protect American families from power plant emissions of mercury and other toxic air pollutions like arsenic, acid gases, nickel, selenium, and cyanide. These long overdue standards will help make our children and our communities healthier. MATS will eliminate 20 tons of mercury emissions and hundreds of thousands of tons of acid gas and toxic pollution each year. The control equipment that reduces these toxic emissions also will reduce fine particle pollution. As a result, MATS will help protect children and adults from the effects of exposure to toxic air pollution, saving thousands of lives and preventing more than 100,000 heart and asthma attacks each year. We project that the annual public health benefits for MATS are $37 to $90 billion, far outweighing the annual projected cost of $9.6 billion. Technically, we know how to achieve these reductions. MATS relies on widely available, proven pollution controls that are already in use at more than half of the nation's coal-fired power plants. These standards are affordable. EPA projects that electricity prices on average will rise only 3% as a result of MATS. With MATS and the cross-state rule combined, rates are projected to be well within the range of normal historic fluctuations, as this graph that's projected and that's in my written comments shows. In addition, the updated standard will support thousands of good jobs for American workers who will be hired to build, install, and then operate the pollution control equipment. Furthermore, the country can achieve these reductions while maintaining a strong and reliable electric grid. Several EPA and Department of Energy analysis conclude that MATs will not adversely affect capacity reserve margins in any region of the country. A January 2012 Congressional Research Service report reached similar conclusions. The reliability concerns we heard were largely tied to concerns that 3 years were not enough time for compliance. We addressed those concerns. Sources would generally have over 4 years until the spring of 2016 to comply with MATs, and reliability critical units will have the opportunity for an additional year. All power plants will have at least 3 years. That's the compliance date that we establish in the rules under the Clean Air Act. In addition, state or local permitting authorities can grant that additional year under certain circumstances. And EPA recommends in its rule that this fourth year be broadly available to sources that require it for a wide range of activities, including constructing replacement power, upgrading transmission lines, maintaining reliability while other sources complete their compliance activities. My staff and I have already begun, and we will continue to reach out to states to help develop clear, state-forward processes for requesting and granting these extensions. Additionally, EPA is providing a well-defined pathway for reliability critical units to get up to an additional year beyond the 4 years mentioned above by obtaining a schedule to achieve compliance within an additional year. This pathway is set forth in a policy memorandum from EPA's Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance. While we don't foresee problems with the country maintaining a reliable electric grid as a result of our rules, we do believe that extra vigilance is appropriate to identify and address any potential localized reliability concerns that might arise. My staff and I have been and will continue to work with organizations that have the responsibility for maintaining the nation's electricity reliability, including the Department of Energy, the Federal Energy Resource Commission, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, and the regional transmission organizations. We're working to help power plant owners understand their responsibilities and remain confident that together we do have the tools to address any challenges that may arise in connection with the implementation of the mercury and air toxic standard. In summary, EPA's final MAT standard will reduce emissions of toxic air pollution from power plants. They'll lead to healthier communities and a safer environment. For 40 years, we've been able to implement the Clean Air Act. We've been able to continue to grow the American economy, and we have kept the lights on. MATs will not change that. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Ms. McCarthy. We appreciate your testimony very much. In the analysis that you provided the committee and that we've seen publicly, you indicate that the annualized cost of this new regulation in the year 2015 will be $9.4 billion. And then you said that in 2020 it would be $8.6 billion. In 2030 it would be $7.4 billion. How do you develop those annualized costs if you don't know what the total cost will be?
Well, EPA follows the best practices as well as OMB guidance to develop the costs and benefits information. And we use a standard best management practices for understanding what those annualized costs are.
And what is the total cost?
I do not have the figures that you're asking me for. Actually, Congressman Upton asked us for as well. Those are costs that we don't establish or
So you don't have a total cost for this regulation?
We have an annualized cost because the purpose of the cost.
But what's the annualized cost in 2016?
Costs and benefits.
What's the annualized cost 2016?
Not the $9.6 billion is the annualized cost in 2016. That's compared to
$9.4 billion in 2015.
I'm sorry.
$9.4 billion in 2015. What's 2016?
I believe it's 2016, but we can double check.
Well, what's 2017?
It would be less, but I don't have that exact figure.
Do you have 2018?
No, we used 2016 as the snapshot to compare both
Now, when
costs
you
and
look at these
benefits,
costs,
because it was the most
which you
conservative
don't know
approach.
the answer to, you don't know the total cost. When you look at cost, we have a number of letters from companies that have already announced they're closing down various coal-fired plants as a result of these regulations. Do you look at cost? Do you include the cost of a person who loses their job because of this regulation?
We, in terms of our cost calculations, we look at the costs associated with the control equipment being purchased and installed. We look at the price of electricity and the changes.
But what about
that would
lost
make-
jobs? Do you look at that cost?
We actually estimate in our analysis that this will actually create both short-term and long-term jobs.
Do you look
Will
at the
produce
lost
jobs.
jobs, the cost of that?
We look at benefits associated with increased job growth.
Increased jobs, but do you look at lost jobs, the cost of that? Do you look at the cost of a person who loses their health insurance and their family loses their health insurance? Do you consider that as a cost?
I understand what you're asking, Mr. Chairman, but in this rule, we estimated that it would increase jobs, both short-term
Okay.
and long-term.
So you say it's going to increase jobs. We have plenty of experts who say it's going to lose jobs. But I find it rather appalling that this agency would issue a rule this widespread, this costly, and not even know what the total costs are. I mean, it's almost unbelievable that you would do this. And then, you know, another thing that's quite disturbing is just the name that you give it, mercury, air toxic, the MATs. And every time we hear people talking about it, we talk about, oh, we're reducing mercury, we're reducing the acid gas, we're reducing the non-metallic components. And yet all of the analysis indicate that the dollar value of the benefits from the reductions of those are almost nil. That if you didn't have the co-benefit of the reduction of the particulate matter, you wouldn't have any benefit of any size. I mean, it appears to me it's misleading the American people. I know we have Mr. Hiscock from the evangelical group here who've been running ads in various members' districts about how dangerous it is about this mercury reduction, that it's important that we reduce mercury. And yet there's no calculated benefit, or very minute, because this rule does not reduce mercury to any calculated benefit. So it's a total misleading of the American people. The only benefit is reduction in particulate matter.
Mr.
So
Chairman, would you
that's
like me
very
to respond
disappointing
that?
to me. And at this time, I would like to recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Markey, for 5 minutes.
And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the ranking member, Mr. Rush, for allowing me this courtesy. In the movie Groundhog Day, a weatherman named Phil Connors, played by Bill Murray, finds himself repeating the same day over and over and over again. And here we are in the same committee room for this committee's 10th hearing relating to EPA's regulations to remove toxic chemicals from power plants and other industrial sources. For the 5th time, Gina McCarthy has come to defend her agency against the specious claims that President Obama just doesn't want Americans to have jobs. And on the House floor, Republicans have already voted to weaken, delay, or repeal these regulations at least 40 times so far. It's Groundhog Day here in the House with the same hearings, the same bills, the same votes over and over again. Puxatawny Phil saw his shadow. 6 more weeks of winter. Ms. McCarthy, you're just like Puxatawny Phil, but you have 8 more months of appearances before this committee to say the same thing over and over and over again. That is their plan. Clearly, this is a Republican majority that has run out of new bad ideas, so they've just decided to recycle all of their old bad ideas. This may be the only type of recycling which the Republicans actually support. Of course, at each of these hearings, Republicans claim over and over again that America must choose between air conditioning and air quality. They tell us that we have to choose between pollution and power plants. But the Republicans are giving us a false choice. We may not have to choose between manufacturing and mercury. We do not have to choose between concrete and cancer. We do not have to choose between the next generation and generators. Just yesterday, in this very committee, during the debate on the Keystone Pipeline, the Republicans said we should just ignore the environment, ignore pipeline safety, ignore public health, ignore the fact that none of the oil or fuel from this pipeline will stay in this country and benefit our citizens. And why do none of these things matter? Because of jobs, the majority says. Republicans even accuse Democrats of not liking the blue-collar jobs they say the Keystone Pipeline will create. According to the EPA, the regulations that are subject to today's hearings will create 46,000 short-term construction jobs. That is nearly 8 times the 6,000 temporary jobs that the State Department estimated for construction of the Keystone XL pipeline. An independent report from the Economic Policy Institute estimated that this rule could create between 28,000 and 158,000 jobs by 2015. That could be as many jobs as 26 Keystone pipelines would create. The Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts found that EPA's Clean Air Act cross-state air pollution rule and the mercury rule would together create nearly 1.5 million jobs over 5 years. That's 250 Keystone pipelines. Ms. McCarthy, the Clean Air Act is one of the reasons for tremendous growth in the U.S. environmental technologies industry and has been estimated to support 1.6 million jobs over the past 40 years. Is that your understanding?
Yes, it is.
So assuming Keystone is able to create the 6,000 jobs State Department generously estimates it would, we would need 267 Keystone pipelines under that math to create the equivalent number of jobs as U.S. environmental technologies that have been created under the Clean Air Act. Is that correct?
I will have to take your word for the math, Congressman.
But assuming that,
Yes.
that the division is correct?
Yes.
And isn't it true that EPA's mercury rule will create 8,000 long-term utility jobs?
That is what our estimates project, yes.
Well, that, again, is more permanent jobs than the number of temporary construction jobs the State Department estimates the Keystone Pipeline will create. So while the Republicans are crying crocodile tears over the 6,000 temporary jobs that the Keystone XL pipeline will create, they make us vote over and over and over again to kill tens of thousands of jobs that are created simply by ensuring that our air is clean to breathe. This certainly would seem like a ridiculous comedy if the consequences weren't so serious. I can only wish, when I rise and shine tomorrow morning, this old movie won't be repeated yet again here in this committee, because I like Bill Murray's version much better, how that movie turned out. I don't see a good ending to the way in which the Republicans want to deal with the environment and job creation in this country. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Markey. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before Mr. Markey leaves, we've been debating pronunciations of bitumen and bitumen. So we did additional research, Mr. Markey. And if you go on the online Oxford edition, unfortunately, we're both correct, because they'll have a pronunciation of the words. And I take the English version, and you take the American. I have the old money version. You have the new money version.
You're taking the British version of how to speak it, which is so Southern Illinois, and I'm taking the American version.
You know where the Industrial Revolution began, right? It was those old dirty coal packs in England that helped fuel their power. So,
and they came to America. They came to Boston, and Miss McCarthy and I, we took their language as Irish, and we said, no, let's use it correctly here. Let's put the.
So I just want to put that on for record for those who followed
you
Keystone
said,
yesterday.
unfortunately, we're both correct. That would be reconciliation, which is good. Okay,
it's hard to believe it could happen
right
here.
We hope that we can do the same thing with the EPA and the Clean Air Act, that we both...
All right, reclaiming my time.
Thank you.
Ms. McCarthy, thank you for coming. I do appreciate our time, and I do appreciate every time you appear. Even though it seems contentious, we've discussed and talked offline. So a couple questions. We do have concerns with this annualized impact analysis. 9.4 billion in 2015, and then we skip to 2020 and say, well, that year, that annualized cost is going to be 8.6 billion. And then we skip to 2030, and you say, then it's going to be 7.4 billion. You're testifying today that you cannot provide us with estimates for the intervening years. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm indicating that the way in which we do this is we compare an annualized cost very conservatively where the cost would be the highest with the annualized benefits.
So, I think we'll have other folks on the second panel who say, well, we can. And that's the problem. We're going to say, you're going to use these annualized numbers that industry will say it's just not in the ballpark. Let me ask this question, and how long past 2030 do you envision these annualized costs occurring?
Well, we don't know. We can't project right now, and I certainly can't tell you how much lower they're going to go, nor can I tell you how much more increase in benefits will accrue from this rule.
And let me then follow up, because, again, with my friend Mr. Markey, people from my district want me fighting for coal. And as the chairman of the recycling caucus, I take offense. We had a great bill moved out of this committee to make sure we could recycle coal ash, which is an additional cost. This is one of the multitude of attacks on coal and electricity generation, boiler MACT, mercury MACT, coal ash. That's our problem. So my folks send me here to fight for coal. My folks send me here to fight for low-cost power because jobs and incomes. Atlantic Cities did an article, what happens to small town when its coal plant shuts down? The mayor of the East Lake was quoted as saying it's a huge hit in terms of lost revenue for a town and school district. In doing your analysis, did you consider what happens to small town America when they lose their coal-fired power plant? And we are losing 3 based upon recent rules in the state of Illinois.
Well, I will tell you that the rule itself didn't project a significant amount of closures that would result as a result of.
But you can understand small town rural America, if that's their only facility, high best wages, good benefits, good health care, what it does to the school system when that's no longer on the tax rolls, what it does to the local hospital when they no longer have a paying private sector industry. Kind of follows up to on the next panel, we have a representative from the Navajo Nation who says this rule will be cataclysmic to the Navajo Nation. Do you consider these economic impacts in your consideration of the rule?
We certainly take a look, and we are able to take a look nationally and regionally at what the impacts of the rule might be in terms of electricity capacity. We're also working really closely with local communities, with the Navajo in particular. I was there last week at the Navajo generating station. We're looking at these rules.
And if I can reclaim my time, I have 19 seconds. Their testimony will say you have not worked with them. So we need to get a meeting of the minds. And just to finalize, Mr. Markey's tirade on the Keystone XL pipeline. Remember, it's the plumbers and pipe fitters who support the Keystone Pipeline, Laborers International, the AFL-CIO, International Brotherhood of Teamsters, International Brother of Electrical Workers, operating engineers, many who support me. I'm a pro-labor, building, construction, trade guy. So they're barking up the wrong tree for trying to stop the Keystone Pipeline. I yield back.
At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Dingell, for 5 minutes of questionings.
I thank you for your courtesy, and I commend you for this hearing. Administrator McCarthy, first I'd like to welcome you back to the subcommittee. I appreciate your willingness and patience to answer questions. I would also like to thank you for taking time last year to meet with 2 utilities from my home state of Michigan, DTE and CMS, and I'm appreciative of the fact that you were able to take the time to listen to their concerns. Administrator McCarthy, you may know I wrote a letter last December along with Senators Levin and Stabenow to Administrator Jackson. We expressed our concern for sensible measures to reduce emissions of hazardous air pollutants in order to protect human health and the environment. However, we also pointed out that some utilities may not have enough time to comply with emission standards. Can you inform us what steps EPA has taken to address that concern?
I can, Mr. Dingle, and thank you for your letter. We received a lot of comment concerning the timeline and the rule. As I indicated in my opening statement, we not only provided the 3 years that we are allowed to provide under the Mass Rule for compliance, but we also directed states and provided guidance to them to be very forward-leaning in terms of making available the 4th year for units that
You actually have potential for 4 and perhaps for 5 years.
And we also developed an enforcement policy to utilize an administrative order that could provide a 5th year for reliability critical units.
Thank you, ma'am. Now, in order for the utilities to request a 1-year extension to comply with the new rule, what specific requirements or commitments will utilities have to meet in order to receive an extension? I won't object if you want to submit that to us for the record.
I'm more than happy to do that.
Now, I know that the final rule has not yet been published in the Federal Register, but have any utilities contacted you to discuss the process of requesting a 1-year extension discussed in the final rule? In other words, could you submit for the record to us what the utilities will have to do to procure that extension?
We will.
And just submit that to the record, please. Now, as utilities prepare to upgrade their larger facilities and meet the new rule, some of these facilities will have to be taken offline in order to install the new technologies. While these larger facilities are offline, utilities may have to depend on older facilities in order to meet the base and peak demand. These older facilities will not likely be upgraded to meet the new rules. Now here comes the rub. As utilities are going to go through this retrofitting process, can they apply for a waiver for the older facilities to operate beyond the 3 years to ensure reliability during the transition? Yes or no?
Yes,
Would you submit for the record how that would be done, please?
we will.
Now, Madam Administrator, I understand that there have been 2 instances where the Department of Energy required utilities to reactivate generation facilities in order to meet reliability requirements. These facilities were not in compliance with clean air requirements, and it's my understanding that they were subsequently fined by EPA. Do you believe that the new mercury and air toxic standards provide room and flexibility to ensure that reliability is not jeopardized?
We will work together, Mr. Dingle, and I'll provide you information on the case that you've referenced. I do not believe that EPA fined that facility, but there certainly is a concern that those issues raise, and we'll address those to you in written comment.
I thank you for that. I would also like to see sufficient attention given to that we could have a good answer to those questions in the record. And if you would submit that for the record, it would be much appreciated, because there's a great deal of concern amongst the utilities on this particular matter. Now, Madam Administrator, should this situation occur again, that is what I have been referring to earlier, will the EPA explore ways to work with utilities so that the utilities are not fined?
We are exploring with them the issues that they're facing and how to face those challenges together right now. We are raising these issues. We're working with the regional transmission organizations. We're working with each of the states and with individual utilities right now to ensure that there is a pathway forward where we will absolutely be able to provide reliable, cost-effective electricity and achieve compliance with these rules.
Now, Madam Administrator, I note that you have a number of agencies, federal, state, EPA, and also you have to address the concerns of the Department of Energy, which has its reliability responsibilities. You have said, and this is comforting to me, that you are working with the utilities. But it appears to me to be very necessary that you should also be working, for example, with the Department of Energy, with the several state agencies, perhaps with the reliability councils and others, so that you can achieve the necessary purposes of avoiding fining utilities behaving in good faith but trying to serve a number of different masters. Can EPA give us assurance that you will be working with these other agencies as well as the utilities to avoid this kind of situation.
I can provide that assurance, and the President directed the agencies to work together, and we are doing that.
Thank you, Madam Administrator. Mr. Chairman, you've been most courteous. I'm 1 minute over time, and I thank you.
Thank you. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Dr. Burgess, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank Ms. McCarthy for being here again. Can we talk for just a minute about the energy policy that is being followed by this administration? Of course, we got some clues 4 years ago when President Obama was running for president, and he said, so if somebody wants to build a coal-fired power plant, they can. It's just that we will bankrupt them. So could a new coal-fired power plant be built today that meets the new utility MACT rule, or is the EPA effectively taking coal off the table for our future energy portfolio, consistent with what President Obama said when he was running for president?
Well, let me just say that we believe that you could not only construct a new coal facility that meets the new coal standards, but we believe there is an existing facility that already does achieve the toxic standards in this rule.
No surprise that not everyone agrees with that. We may hear some testimony in the second panel that provides some additional insight into that. Let me ask you this. I come from a part of the country that does not produce coal. We do produce a fair amount of natural gas through a procedure known as hydraulic fracturing. Is the EPA planning further restrictions on the production of natural gas?
Are you asking, are we looking at additional emissions rules relative to oil and gas? I'm just trying to speak
Correct.
straightforward.
Are there going to be further restrictions placed on the production of natural gas through hydraulic fracturing that the EPA is now contemplating?
Well, I can speak for the AIR program, and we are finalizing an oil and gas new source performance standard that does relate to oil and gas development. That looks at emissions associated.
And when will that appear?
It is due to be finalized this spring.
Well, is there, you just worry that you take coal out of the equation. A lot of people feel nuclear no longer belongs in our armamentarium. If natural gas is under assault as well, where do we get our energy? We've heard testimony in this committee last session of Congress when the Waxman-Markey bill was being debated that without energy, life is cold, brutal, and short. I think that's still true. So where are we going to get our energy if we take all of these sources off the table?
I believe that the MATS rule that we're discussing today allows existing coal to continue to run. I believe it allows new coal to be sited and constructed. I believe that the rules we're contemplating on the oil and gas industry, on natural gas, will continue to allow natural gas to be utilized. The only thing we're doing in this rule in particular is using available cost-effective controls to minimize harmful emissions of toxic chemicals that are impacting American families. That does not mean that we are precluding any type of energy from being utilized or constructed.
But on the one hand, it seems like you're eliminating other sources of energy, driving electrical suppliers to natural gas, and on the other hand, there are going to be new regulations that make this problematic as well. Not just in your department, but also on the studies of groundwater. And we want it to be safe, but at the same time, we know we have to have energy available. You know, we've talked before, and it doesn't take long in your testimony where you refer to asthmatics whose lives will be improved because of the things that you are doing. You didn't disappoint, was in your third paragraph, prevent 100,000 heart and asthma attacks each year. I just got to tell you, I do not believe that the EPA is serious about reducing asthma in this country, because as someone who suffers from asthma, I can no longer buy an over-the-counter asthma inhaler. As of January 1st, you removed it. You said that the CFCs were not permitted, that there's going to be a hole in the ozone, And as a consequence, Primatene Mist, which I relied upon for years and years and years, is now gone. Many of us are inconsistent asthmatics. That is, we're not asthmatic all the time. So we may move away from our maintenance medications, but then at 2 o'clock in the morning, something happens. Mountain cedar, someone goes by on a horse and carriage, triggers our asthma, and we're in trouble. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, used to be you could go down to the all-night pharmacy and buy a Primatene inhaler. You can't do that anymore. The only option you have is to go to the hospital emergency room and spend $800 to $1,500 getting a breathing treatment. How is that enhancing the life of asthmatics in this country?
Mr. Burgess, as you know, there have been much review. There has been much review of the issue of Primatene Mist, not only at EPA, but primarily at FDA, in concert with many medical associations. The decision was made that the Primatene Mist did not, was available to be phased out because of concerns with the ozone layer without impacting the treatment that is medically available and that is useful for individuals.
It didn't work. It didn't work. And as a consequence, we cannot buy the leftover Primatene in the pharmacy any longer, and we're left to find much more expensive solutions to those problems that occur. This is something that could be fixed, and people, frankly, do not understand why it cannot be fixed. We had Margaret Hamburg in here from the FDA at the Health Subcommittee the other day, and she said that it wasn't their problem, it was the EPA's problem. I'm asking you, fix this problem. People want it done.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do share your concerns, and I do think the problem needs to be fixed. Asthma is a very, very there are high incidence of asthma and asthma related illnesses in my district, and so I want you to know I empathize with and I share your concern. But along those lines, Ms. McCarthy, I know that this has been kind of a protracted struggle that you've been engaged in here with us, and but we're here today, and I welcome you again. You know, I feel for you. You know, I shouldn't have to be here, but the second panel, there are witnesses on the second panel who allege that the EPA has inflated the health benefits of the air toxics rule. In particular, they argue that EPA has overestimated the value of reducing emissions of deadly fine particles, which are linked to asthma attacks, stroke, heart attacks, and premature deaths. Ms. McCarthy, do you have a response to these allegations, and would you share your responses?
Thank you. I would respond by saying that EPA did its best job working with congressional panels who did a peer-reviewed study of how we do our cost and benefits approach. There are clearly benefits associated with the reduction of toxic emissions of mercury, arsenic, cyanide. Many of those toxic emissions and those benefits cannot be specifically calculated because of data and methodology problems. It doesn't mean that mercury doesn't cause neurological challenges for our children. We calculate those as best we can. But we also identified that the control technologies that are going to be put in place as a result of this rule also bring benefits associated with reductions in particulate matter. We counted those reductions. We used the best available science, both the science that is being driven by our peer-reviewed literature, by our guidance with our Office of Management and Budget. We used the exact, most transparent way of calculating those, and we included them in benefits. There is no reason to deny the public the numbers associated with the full suite of public health benefits that are accrued as a result of this rule, just because the rule itself isn't targeting those reductions. It is coming with the rule itself, and that is what is driving significant public health benefits, as well as those benefits we just can't calculate that stem from reduction of toxic pollution that is impacting children and adults in this country.
I think that should put to rest this fallacy that's being perpetuated, you know, at each one of these hearings, each one of your appearances.
Mr. Chairman, these are all real benefits to real people. People should know about them, and we're telling them about the benefits. Thank you.
Thank you. Last year in September, the committee in the full House passed the Train Act that nullifies the EPA's mercury air standard or air toxics rules, requiring the EPA to start from scratch. It prohibits the EPA from issuing a new rule for at least 2 years and bars implementation for at least 5 years. I can't. It doesn't make sense. I can't seem to see the rhyme or the reason that this committee, the subcommittee, never ever had a hearing on the public health implications of nullifying these rules before passing the bill. So, Ms. McCarthy, just for the record, how would nullifying the mercury and air toxics rules affect public health?
The mercury and air toxics rules are now 20 years overdue. If we are denied the ability to move this rule forward and implement it, you are denying significant public health improvements that Congress anticipated that EPA would produce for the American public. You are denying the ability for us to move forward with cost-effective rules that will actually provide healthier families and healthier communities across the entire United States.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, could I defer at this point in time and let one of the other members who's been here ask questions? I do want to ask questions, but I still have some studying to do. So if you'd go to somebody else who sit here.
This time, I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. And good morning, Ms. McCarthy.
Good morning.
Thanks for coming today. And the people I represent back home in Texas 22 have a lot of questions they want me to ask you this morning. It's going to center on costs for the utility MACT bill and grid reliability. And just starting out, you know, everyone in this room is entitled to their own opinion, but no one is entitled to their own facts. And that's what we're hearing today, ma'am, is the facts. My home state is still experiencing severe drought conditions. We just went through the hottest August in record. In my district, in the Houston district, we were over 100 degrees for the entire month of August. While most people up here don't think that's unique, that is. We'll go over 100 maybe 10 times a year normally. We have 100% humidity a lot longer than that. But experts are going to predict that this pattern is going to continue. And so reliability of the grid is particularly important. And ERCOT, the entity that regulates our grid in Texas, expects capacity shortages. And if we're going to have rolling blackouts in the soaring heat, young and elderly lives are going to be in danger. The very people that this supposed rule is going to protect. These aren't projected lives saved, but real lives lost. And the people in Texas 22, I've got to be honest with you, ma'am, are skeptical about the administration's motive. They remember then Canada Obama's statements to a San Francisco editorial board that under his policies, energy prices will, quote, necessarily skyrocket, end quote, basically making the cost of fossil fuels too expensive and making the other fuels, the alternative fuels, economically viable. I share their concerns. EPA claims that the benefits to this bill are $90 billion, but the experts say that the benefits to the mercury are much, much lower, $500,000 a year. And just I've got a little chart here, just focusing on the mercury issue. As you can see on this chart, blood levels are significantly below exposure levels. I mean, look at this. This is the World Health Organization up here, and they're at 20 micrograms per liter. The European Food Safety Authority down here, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency down here. Obviously, we've got the lowest mercury standards in the entire world. And we were above the limits in blood mercury levels in women ages 16 to 49, 95th percentile, from 1999 to 2000. President Bush takes office, we go below for the first time, 4.6 milligrams per liter. 4.4, 2003, 2004. 4.5, 2005 to 2006. 3.8, 2007 to 2008. So this chart shows that EPA, we're below EPA's own standards right here. And yet you're calling this thing the Mercury and Air Toxin Standards Rule. It can't be mercury, looking at this chart. So the question I have for you, and this is what my people back home want me to ask, are these numbers being used, the mercury being used to get at to the minuscule mercury exposure to actually get reductions of particulate matter? Yes or no? Again, are you using mercury to get another target, particulate matter?
This standard is about reducing toxic pollution. It has the co-benefit of reducing particulate matter.
Co-benefit. Ma'am, you're below the levels right now. And again, people are skeptical. We are over 95%. This is from, again, we get you all the information.
I'm sorry, I don't know what, are those numbers reflective of what? The blood level mercuries?
Blood level mercury, yes ma'am. The y-axis going up is the blood level mercury. That's micrograms per liter. And then the number here is just what's decreased, what's happened over the number of years. As you can see, this is the World Health Organization, European Food Safety Authority, U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, your agency. We were above EPA only 1999 to 2000. And then since that point forward, from 2001 to 2008, we've had significant decreases. We've been below EPA's own levels. So I'm very skeptical about this thing being called some sort of mercury bill and not being used to get again to act to the particulate matter. But I've got to move on, ma'am. There's a lot more questions from my people. Thank you. The other thing, I've gotten questions from our chairman here. He talked about jobs gained and jobs lost. You kept just talking about the jobs gained, jobs gained, jobs gained. That's only half the equation. I mean, we need to know about how many jobs are lost as well, because it's the net that's important, not just the only jobs gained, but the net of jobs gained versus jobs lost. And I've got a bill, H.R. 1341, the Establishing Public Accountability Act, that's going to require EPA to do a study of the job impact overall. Jobs lost, jobs gained, jobs sent overseas, and to do it before the public comment period so the public has the ability to determine whether or not they'll get some review of that information. Would you support that bill?
Our job numbers are net, so I would be happy to have any additional information and participate.
Okay, thank you, because I understood you kept talking about jobs gained, so I just thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Thank you, Mr. Olson. At this time, I recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And good morning, Administrator McCarthy.
Good morning.
And really to everyone that values clean air across America, I want to thank you for your perseverance, because after all, it's been 21 years since the passage of the Clean Air Act amendments, and we finally have a proposed air toxic standard that will regulate mercury and other toxic air pollutants that is based on the best science and technology. These substances are some of the most toxic, carcinogenic, and dangerous pollutants. Mercury is known to cause devastating damage to the brain. Mercury is of particular concern to women of childbearing age, infants and children, because mercury exposure damages the nervous system, which can impair children's ability to think and learn. I guess it's no surprise that a lot of public health groups see this as a great victory, like the American Lung Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics. But I think people across the country would also be interested in knowing that religious organizations, sportsmen's organizations like hunters and anglers also support the rule. But they may be particularly surprised to understand how many utilities support this rule. 36 energy businesses and business associations, including Calpine, Constellation Energy, Entergy, Exelon, NRG Systems, Pacific Gas and Electric, and Public Service Enterprise Group, have expressed their support. And in fact, in my home state of Florida, a number of utilities that operate coal-fired power plants have expressed their commitment to coming into compliance. I think that's very telling. See, many of those utilities over the years have invested in the technology. They've continued to make good profits, but part of that has been being responsible businesses. They have invested in technology to reduce their emissions. The technology is in widespread use all across the country. But the dirtiest power plants have put off installing pollution controls for decades. So hopefully this is going to spur everyone to come up to the best science, use the best technology. It will create jobs. But, Madam Administrator, I understand that there will be some that are going to be affected. They've kind of stared in the face of the evolution in technology and haven't gone down that road, and now they're going to have to. But explain that compliance period. How long will businesses, utilities have to come into compliance?
We are generally talking about the ability for companies to have a 3 to 4 year window, which brings us to the spring of 2016. Units that are necessary for reliability purposes will have a defined pathway that they can come to the agency and get a 5th year added on to that, which brings us to 2017. And we do not even anticipate that most will need a 4-year window, never mind a 5th year. But we are fully prepared to address those issues to ensure that we meet the President's clear directive that we keep the lights on while we address issues that are so critical to the health of American families related to toxic air pollution.
So, I mean, 3 to 4 to 5 years. Some, I bet, have argued that that's too lenient. What is that compliance time frame of 3 to 4 to 5 years based upon? What study went into that time period?
Well, it is a statutory requirement that we look at what kinds of technologies are in the marketplace that are cost-effective and available, and then we give sufficient time under the statute to be able to allow those to be constructed. We have looked at in detail with the Department of Energy, and others have looked at this as to whether it's sufficient time. We know the types of control technologies that will be required. We understand the time it takes to construct those, to engineer them, to put them in place, and we believe that the timeline that is being provided with this rule and with the other pathways available to us will be more than sufficient to address the challenges associated with compliance and keeping the lights on.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Unfortunately, my colleague from Massachusetts left, and he made an interesting analogy about Groundhog Day, but unfortunately, he missed the point. Groundhog Day, by repeating the message, the actor of the story got the message finally, and he became a better person. And that's what we're trying to do here. We're going to repeat it and repeat it and repeat it until America understands that what effect these rules are going to have, because what we've said to you and your predecessors and others is that just because you can doesn't mean you should. It's a business lesson. And for those of us that have come from the business community, we understand just because you can doesn't mean you should, and then because there are consequences of what you do. So, for example, powerhouses all across America are shutting down because of the onslaught of EPA rules. Just, if I could just show you, here's, for visual for people to understand, here are the plants that are going to be closing across America. Because short time frame, and the rules are simply too severe to comply. Just this morning, The company announced 3 more powerhouses are going to close, in addition to the 6 they already have. Hundreds of jobs are going to be lost, health care benefits. Nationally, you can see the drama that will play out. But curiously, last December, in your own testimony and then today again, you said that you only think the loss of gigawatts will only be in the neighborhood of 4.7 gigawatts. But yet, every other group in America that have studied this has said that you are grossly misleading the American public and concealing information apparently from Congress, because your number is down here where all the others are up in a much higher level. I think there's a real question about your capability of doing your own mathematics. Some have said it could be as high as 75 gigawatts, not 4.7. Just in the last 48 hours, we've had one power company reduce 3.6 gigawatts. Earlier this year, AEP came out and said 6 gigawatts. Between the two of them are 10. That's twice the number that you've suggested. It's so blatantly false what you're representing to us in this. And what you're doing is this war on coal is not just a war on coal in the industry, but it's a war on the miners and the families and the communities. You're devastating them with these kind of threats. But more importantly, what you have to understand, and we've heard it throughout this whole thing, has been the increased cost of the utility. You say 3%. Utilities companies are saying 13 to 15%. Again, what are we supposed to believe? Your numbers that you keep giving us are flawed, and they're proven out time and time again as being unreliable. Just in the last 10 years, half of the American families have seen their energy costs double, and you're saying it's only going to increase 3%. Now, I wish what you would do is the EPA, all of you, would take some of your resources and look at where possibly the real culprit is, and that cost, and bear that in mind. All the quotes that we keep hearing coming from the other side of the aisle talk about asthma, heart, but no one differentiates between outdoor air and indoor air quality. If you look surprised, have you considered indoor air quality? Do you understand that 90% of our hours that we're on this planet, 90% of our day is spent in a building? Only 10% in that outdoor air quality. 90%, 60% of it's in our homes. We have 56 million children and families that go into a school building every day and deal with bad air quality. Indoor air quality is one of the biggest issues we should be addressing. And when we talk about the asthma conditions that occur, why don't we look at the fact that historically, with all the drops in all of the contaminants that are occurring across America, asthma is increasing. All this money that's being spent by the powerhouses to reduce a particular matter, whether it's NOx, SOx, or whatever it's going to be in the air to contribute to that, has not been offset the fact that asthma has actually increased across America. I'd like to see you spend some time to do the research to find out what that's about. Instead of spending, we have 700 powerhouses in America that need to be upgraded. And for you to say $9.4 billion annually is just patently preposterous. Everyone in this room that has any sense of engineering and facts knows that you can't do it for that amount of time. Unfortunately, my time has run out, but so I didn't get a chance. But I hope you can respond finally to some questions, issues that we've raised, because I've asked you for questions in the past for answers, and you've not gotten back to me. Thank you.
This time, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The idea that EPA requirements to clean up air pollution will hurt the economy and kill jobs is now a Republican economic dogma. But these are the same doom and gloom scenarios we've heard from industry since the Clean Air Act was first adopted in 1970, and none of them have come true. The truth is it takes workers to install new pollution controls and construct cleaner power plants. That's why groups representing over 125,000 U.S. businesses support the air toxic standards. And, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a unanimous consent request to insert this letter of support into the record. During a recent call with investors in discussing the effects of the mercury and air toxics rule, American Electric Power CEO Michael Morris even stated, quote, "Once you put capital money to work, jobs are created," end quote. EPA has come to the same conclusion. The agency estimates that compliance with the new air toxic standards will be a net job creator, not a job killer. Ms. McCarthy, how many jobs could be created as power companies comply with the new standards?
We estimate that as many as 46,000 jobs will be created on a temporary basis to assist with the construction and installation, and 8,000 permanent jobs will be created.
Can you explain how complying with these new air toxics standards will create jobs?
Yes, because the standards will require, in particular, some of the small, inefficient coal-fired facilities to make a choice between continuing to run and investing. There are a number of facilities that will need to install control equipment. That will mean engineering jobs. That will mean construction jobs. We estimate that there will be investments made, as we indicated, up to $9.6 million in 2016 alone. That means that we'll have construction jobs, and in the long term, we'll have permanent jobs at those facilities to manage that control equipment, and it, of course, will allow us significant health benefits that will really be of benefit to American families in terms of lower health care costs and improved health of particularly our children.
Thank you. As economist Josh Bivens will point out in the second panel, these regulations are expected to have particularly positive effects under current economic conditions. American industry isn't short of cash. It is short of demand for its products, and spending capital to hire workers and buy equipment injects desperately needed cash into the economy, stimulating demand. The record bears this out. Over the last 40 years, the economy has continued to grow as EPA has set new standards to cut air pollution from every industrial sector. Can you discuss some other examples of how implementing the Clean Air Act has created jobs in engineering, manufacturing, construction, and other highly skilled areas?
I certainly can, and there have been studies done of this, which we're happy to provide to the committee. But you look at everything from car rules, including the ones that we're contemplating now, that are leading to new, cost-effective cars available to people that save them money. We are looking at the installation of catalytic converters that actually significantly helped to reduce emissions from cars, that led to the growth of industries in the United States that are now exporting to other countries. There is great documentation about our rules initiating expertise and innovation and technology improvement that is bringing world-class industries developing in the United States that then export to other countries. Control technologies in the air pollution sector are, for the most part, have been designed in the United States, manufactured in the United States. A lot of that has been driven by the requirements under the Clean Air Act.
In addition to the overblown rhetoric about the impact of this rule on jobs, some have warned that this rule will cause electricity prices to skyrocket. EPA estimates that the rule will cause electricity prices to increase by just 3% on average by 2015, falling to 2% by 2020 and less than 1% by 2030. Can you put this 3% increase in context for us?
I can. It's well within the normal fluctuations that we have seen, and it's the increase that we would estimate as a result of this rule is less than what folks would have paid in 2009 for electricity. It translates into about $3 per household per month.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Pompeo, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ms. McCarthy, for being here today. Do any existing units currently meet the new unit standards?
One.
What plant is that?
It's a plant in New Jersey. I think it's called the Logan.
Is this Logan 1?
That's
yeah, it's
right.
called Logan, referred as Logan 1. So there's a single, of all the plants in the United States of America today, there is a single existing plant that meets these new requirements. Is that, did I ask the question correctly to get the answer I got from you?
No, let me just indicate that we don't have all the information on all the plants in terms of whether or not they would comply. We are aware of one plant that I indicated that would meet this new source
So to the
standard.
best of your
There may be
knowledge, with
others.
all of the data that you have, there is a single plant that you are aware of that currently would comply with the new
That
rules
we
for
have
it to
data
be
to
built.
verify, that's
Great.
correct.
I appreciate that. That's not very many. That's a far cry from what you've described as a process that can be accomplished in 3 to 5 years.
Well, the good news is for the existing plants in those standards, there are many dozens and dozens, actually, that will comply out of the gate.
Sure. I understand. In Kansas, we've got a plant we've been trying to build that has an existing air permit. It's been granted the permit. But because it was unable to break ground and begin construction, it is now going to be trapped under the new regulatory regime. And your rule is issued, I understand, made no exception for plants that already had existing permits granted, but because the Sierra Club and other folks took them to task for years, they weren't able to proceed. Have I got that correct as well?
I would be happy to look into it in detail, but generally, if you're constructing a new facility and you haven't broken ground, you're obligated to meet new source facility standards.
Right. That's their understanding as well. So we talked. Mr. Waxman asked you a question about cost. We'll have testimony today, and I've heard from folks back in the district about increase in costs of a penny a kilowatt hour, 3 cents a kilowatt. You talked about 3% as if it was nothing. I will tell you that when I was in business, we tried to take costs out every year. We had to require costs go down. When your energy costs go up by any amount, it enormously impacts your business and causes you to consider seriously about whether to continue to manufacture or produce chemicals here in the United States. When did you consider the economic impacts to all of those businesses that will be affected by the cost increase for electricity when you promulgated the rules?
We did, to the extent that methodology allows, look at the cascading impact on other sectors, yes. And that impact was negligible.
Do you think that there will be new coal-fired power plants built in the United States following the implementation of this rule?
Actually, I don't make those predictions, so I would hesitate to do that based on my personal knowledge.
If there are no new coal-fired power plants built in America following this rule, would you be willing to at least consider the possibility that it was a direct result of this rule that no such plants were ever built?
Well, actually, our analysis did take a look at whether or not the MATS rule in and of itself would change the dynamic in terms of decisions about building new coal, and we do not believe that it will.
Mr. McKinley showed you some data that refuted your assessment that only 4.7 gigawatts of energy will be lost as a result of this. You think that data is just wrong? We've already got First Energy's announcement. What is it about the data that Mr. McKinley presented you that you think causes that to be at such wide variance from your very low prediction about the impact of the rule on retiring facilities?
I think that we have to acknowledge that there is a transition in the energy world. We have to acknowledge that low natural gas prices is causing a transition. And when these issues come up, and I'm sure they will consistently come up, you have to take a look at it and see what is actually happening. Whether it's the MATS rule or it's an overall business decision that's reflective of that transition. And we could walk through what happened with First Energy. But it appears to us on looking at this that First Energy is making a business decision. And what we are attempting to do is work with the RTOs, with the energy world to understand these dynamics so that we can be informed by this and ensure that the MATS rule can be complied with. But it is not changing the direction in which the industry is heading.
I will tell you that First Energy disagrees with you. I mean, they're public statements. The folks who know the business best tell us that you are wrong about that. So their assessment is very different. So while you said you can't predict about what someone will do about a coal plant, apparently you can predict inside of a company's own business why it's making their own business decision better than the leaders of that business.
Well, the units that they have announced that they are closing now 3 or 4 years in advance of being required to do it under the rule, and they're also an average of 53 years old.
I've got one last question. new coal-fired power plants, have you talked to any of the contractors about whether they're prepared to issue certifications saying that they can meet these new rules? That's what a company needs. If they're going to build a plant, they've got to get financing. They need the contractors to confirm that, in fact, when it's built, it'll be in compliance. Have you talked to any of the contractors who have assured you that they can provide that guarantee?
I have not, but clearly we expect that there will be concerns raised about many aspects of these rules, and we'll take a look at it if people submit data and have concerns.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
This time I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. McCarthy, welcome back. It's good to see you again.
You too.
I want to start by, like my colleague, Congressman Olson, we share East and Southeast Harris County together, and we're concerned about the reliability issues. Last year, Texas suffered 2 major reliability problems when we actually experienced rolling blackouts throughout the state. Since that time, EPA has issued the cross-state air pollution rule, which is something that our utilities had not anticipated having to comply with, and now the utility MACT rule on top of that. The North American Reliability Corporation recently looked at reserve margins in 18 regions covering the 48 mainland U.S. states and found that 2 regions, ERCOT in Texas, the Texas grid in New England, would experience planning margins below the NERC reference level of 15% in 2015. According to the Congressional Research Service, the data suggests that ERCOT may experience reliability problems, but the utility MACT would play a minor role. Of course, industry has different conclusions. Did you or EPA work with our regional grid, ERCOT, during the rulemaking process on the reliability issue? And if so, what were their concerns and how were they addressed?
Actually, we did, and we continue to work with them. I think I would just point out that I believe the study that you identified was on the basis of the proposed rule. And because of the comments that we received, we made significant adjustments in that rule because of the data we received. And recent analysis does indicate, we believe, that the MATS rule will not impact resource capacity in any region. So I think the issues that were raised for ERCOT in the New England states are no longer considered in the same framework because of the changes that we made.
Does ERCOT agree with you on that?
We actually had them on a phone call last week with a number of the RTOs. We're working hand with them. I do not know exactly what their comments might be on the final rule, but if they have concerns, we're certainly open and we'll be working with them.
Okay. One of my concerns is that if we, because of the coal plants in Central Texas and East Texas, if those are required to shut down, I know some companies who are bringing natural gas facilities out of mothball, but they're going through the permitting process. Is there any way EPA could look at some of those natural, some of them are in Harris County, in fact, in Congressman Olson's and I's district, to look at bringing those back on in time? Hopefully we won't have 100-degree temperatures for 200 days or whatever it was last year, but is there an effort to make sure, whether it be ERCOT or even New England, that there's some additional power that will be coming online? And like I said, we have no shortage of natural gas, as we know, in our country, but the permitting process may be longer through EPA to get those plants back up, those mothballed natural gas plants.
We'll be working with folks, Congressman. One of the things that I indicated is that we have developed an enforcement policy that would utilize an administrative order to allow up to 5 years for those types of issues to be addressed. But we'll address those issues, and we're working to identify them now so that there is more than sufficient time to look at what other generation will be constructed and how to address these issues.
I have a number of questions, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to submit them in writing, but let me get to another one. In response to stakeholder comments, EPA received an operational concerns related to the magnitude and technical facility of the retrofit required by the standard. You're now providing sources to the option to use more flexible facility-wide averaging approach, so as long as it provides the equivalent reduction in mercury, for example. Can you elaborate on this, and if the facility-wide averaging program is something that has been pushed in the past, especially during the cap and trade debate, but would we hear often pushback from EPA on looking at a system instead of per unit?
Actually, we proposed an averaging system at the facility, not across facilities, that could be utilized under the rule. What we did in the final rule is to allow that averaging to be a little longer period of time with a little tighter standard to provide more flexibility to those facilities. We believe it's consistent with the law. It's not trading among facilities or within regions that would result in different exposure patterns for communities. So we believe it's consistent and it's good under the law, and that it will provide opportunities for very cost-effective methods to achieve compliance with the rule.
Mr. Chairman, I know I'm out of time, and I just hope we'll invite Ms. McCarthy to come enjoy our hospitality more often, because obviously we have a lot of questions that would, you know, I think it would help with members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. So I thank you for your time.
Yeah, and I'm sure that she'd like to come back more often too, right? At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I appreciate the courtesy of being allowed to defer initially so that I could become somewhat better prepared. It's obvious that everybody in this room wants the best health environment we possibly can here in the United States. It's also, I think, would be a given that we want the best economic opportunity for people here in the United States. You're in an enviable position of having to make decisions that to some extent trade off between those two noteworthy goals. I have really tried to understand this MACT rule, and I have really tried to look at the justification for it and tried to be able to substantiate that, and I just can't do it. I want to talk about health benefits briefly, and then I want to talk about cost. In your, not your rule, but the EPA rule, this is the statistical report that accompanies the rule. It was put out in December. It's, gosh, who knows, 500 pages long. And on table E5, it talks about the reduction in incident ES3, estimated reduction in incidence of adverse health effects of the mercury and air toxic standard at a 95% confidence level. And basically it says that 99.98% of the total benefits are going to be because of reductions in PM 2.5, I think, that only 0.02% of the total benefits are with reductions in mercury. And yet all the press is about mercury reduction. Isn't it true that you get almost no health benefit from the reduction in the new standards for mercury reduction, according to your own statistical analysis?
I do not believe that is an accurate statement. What I will
That's
say
what you
is,
say.
No, what we actually identify the benefits that we can count. We certainly know the toxic impacts associated with mercury. We know that other
I stipulate that mercury is
cause
toxic.
Cancer. We're just not able to quantify those sufficiently because of data, resource methodology.
You talk in your, I don't know if you talked in your testimony, but you gave us an answer to a question. You just said that you used the phrase real people.
Yes.
Real people.
Yes.
Is there a verified incidence of a real person in the United States either dying or being hospitalized because of mercury poisoning that results from a power plant emission?
I don't think I can address that specificity. What we
Well,
look
you just
at
talked
is,
about real people. Okay?
right.
I'm asking you a straight question
and we look at
about
it on,
real
on
people.
populations. I can't name an individual.
Well,
I
you can't name
tell
it because
you,
it doesn't exist.
Well, I can tell you that power plants are the single largest source of mercury emissions. I can tell you that that mercury enters into the food chain. I can tell you
But
that
you
the
cannot
women of
tell me that
childbearing
somebody
age
has
eat
gotten
that
sick
fish.
and died and gone to the hospital in the United States because of exposure to mercury from a power plant smokestack. You can't do it. Now, let me read you something. This is from your report. This isn't me making it up. Down in the sub-footnotes of this table ES3, and this is your table, not you personally, but you're at the EPA's table. the negative estimates for certain endpoints are the result of the weak statistical power of the study used to calculate the health impacts and do not suggest that increases in air pollution exposure result in decreased health impacts. The weak statistical power of the study. Now, if you read these tables, and they have an estimated midpoint, and then they have on the downside and on the upside, and it turns out that they're all over the map. But the most negative impact, when you go through all of these non-fatal heart attacks, hospital admissions, respiratory admissions, cardiovascular, emergency room, acute bronchitis, lower respiratory, upper respiratory, asthma, exacerbation, it turns out that most of the impact is minor restricted activity days. Minor restricted activity days. From 2.5 million to 3.7 million in the eastern United States, from 99,000 to 150,000 in the western United States, and from 2.6 million to 3.8 million nationwide. Minor restricted activity days. Now, minor restricted activity days is going to cost them probably, your own numbers, at least $10 billion a year for 10 years. But you estimate even in the out years it's about $7 billion a year. That's going to cost real jobs and real negative economic impact, and your own tables don't back it up.
Thank you, Mr. Barton. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle, 5 minutes.
Well, that's quite a hard act to follow. Mr. Chairman, thank you for putting the hearing together today, and Ms. McCarthy, thanks for your testimony. Mr. Chairman, we're here today to have another hearing on EPA's utility MACT rule that was finalized in December of last year, and it seems to me that one thing that's often missing from the conversation is that these rules are finally being implemented after years and years of delay. So we shouldn't sit here and pretend like this has just sprung up on our utility and manufacturing sectors in the last year. In fact, EPA has been tasked with regulating mercury since the passage of the 1990 Clean Air Act, and efforts to issue a mercury rule that treated mercury as non-hazardous were thrown out by the courts. And now, after 24 years, we're finally seeing a rule from the EPA that will regulate mercury and other toxins. And yet we sit here trying to sort through these claims that, in fact, 24 years wasn't long enough for the power sector to prepare, and a potential 5 additional years of compliance time provided by the rule, totaling a full 29 years since the power sector knew controlling mercury would be required. We're saying that that's simply too onerous. The fact is the time has come, and the time's now. So let's see what we can do to make sure that the rule has the least negative impact possible on those people who matter the most, American consumers. Administrator McCarthy, in your written testimony, you tell us that though the rule will cause the retirement of some older coal plants, you don't expect that any of these retirements will affect the capacity reserve margins in any region of the country. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Can you tell us why that is?
Because the estimated retirements are basically primarily small coal-fired facilities that are highly inefficient and fairly non-competitive. We believe that this 4.7% is less than 1% of the capacity of generation across the U.S., and we have analyzed this from a resource capacity perspective, and we believe that the uneconomic units that will decide not to continue to operate because they don't want to invest in modern pollution control equipment will be replaced by new capacity, cleaner capacity, and there is sufficient capacity in the system to be able to allow this transition to happen over the next 3 to 4 to 5 years.
Now, can you tell us, do you expect capacity reserve prices to increase in power markets where there will be or have been retirements?
That could very well be the case. We are seeing at least claims of that. But I want to indicate that the increase in capacity reserve market prices are only one factor that impact the retail cost of electricity. We actually calculated where we thought that capacity increase might happen. That was factored into our estimate that retail prices are only likely to, at its maximum, average to 3% across the U.S. And again, that needs to balance against the American families being able to accrue the benefits, which are 9-to-1 against the costs, the benefits associated with lower health costs, being able to make it to work, being able to send your kids to school, that result from the health benefits associated with this rule.
So you're saying that those potential increases were included in EPA's assessment of regional cost impacts?
That
was
correct.
part of your assessment?
Retail cost impacts, that is correct.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's all I have.
This time recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for 5 minutes.
Hi, thank you for being here, and I'm going to ask you for some yes or no answers. If you can't do that, just submit them to me later because I don't have but just a little bit of time allotted to me. Isn't it correct that the vast majority of mercury emissions in our air comes from natural sources such as volcanoes and forest fires or from foreign sources? Second, isn't it also correct that the EPA's proposed rule cites the estimates of global mercury emissions that range from 7,300 to 8,300 tons per year, and between 50 and 70% of that is from natural sources, less than 50% of which would be from man-made sources? Yes or no?
I'll provide
You'll provide me with an answer. I appreciate that. Yes. It seems that the EPA has published that the mercury coming from U.S. power plants of about 29 tons per year under this proposed rule. And isn't it true that that's about 1/3 of the total global mercury air emissions? You'll give me an answer later.
Again, I will, yes.
I appreciate that. And I question, as others have, how you can estimate and then build from that estimate other projections of what's going to happen to the coal-fired power plants when First Energy alone has closed or has eliminated 3.3 of your 4.7 gigawatts of power alone. That doesn't count the other folks. And here's the concern that I have. AEP estimated at a meeting that I was at earlier this year that with the new rules, they were going to have to expend money to clean up another 12% of the air. And there's no question that's a good thing to clean it up. But that for the consumers in the AEP footprint in my area of Virginia, they would pay an additional 10 to 15%. Now, I asked Lisa Jackson earlier this year, and she didn't have an answer for me. And if you've got one, please submit it later. What is the impact when I've got a district with the median household income is $36,000 a year? You raise the electric cost. What's the health impact on my constituents when they can't afford to heat their homes? And doesn't that have a negative impact? And I don't believe that was considered in your estimates of the health benefits. And so I would ask that you submit that to me as well. And I would submit to you also that having people out of work also affects their health. I think every statistic shows that. And I pick up Mr. McKinley's chart, and he showed you the coal power plants that are closing down. And we've got a dot right here. That's the same spot in a small county that Boiler MACT might very well put 700 jobs out of business at. So we're double whammying with different EPA rules the rural communities of this country. And I would have to ask you, do you know if the new Dominion plant being built in Virginia City area is going to meet the new standards that you all have come out with? Do you know that?
I do not. I'm not familiar.
If you could find out for me, I appreciate it, because that's just south of this dot right here. And so what we're talking about is from one regulation after another, the 9th District of Virginia and all the parts of the country are being hammered on jobs. And I submit to you that the United States has got a job problem, if y'all haven't figured that out by now, and that we shouldn't be piling on regulations that are killing jobs. We want to move in the right direction, but we can't be killing our economy. And I would have to ask you that if we had a regulation that we could eliminate an instrumentality or something, we were going to get rid of power and we're going to get rid of those jobs, if we could save from 1990 to the present, I'm looking at page 9 of your report where you said that the current regs had saved 160,000 lives. What if in that same time period we could have eliminated direct, not indirect, but direct, about 700,000 premature deaths? Would that be a good thing? And should we have regulations that would prohibit and make it clear that those deaths wouldn't occur?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I followed the question.
The question is, if there were a regulation that could save directly 700,000, forget the job impact, 700,000 lives, would you all be recommending that to the President?
I would have to tell you what, I'd have to decide whether it was consistent with the law and my authority. That's all I'm doing here.
Okay.
That's all I would speak to.
So you wouldn't be, notwithstanding the fact that we could save all those lives, it wouldn't matter, is what you're saying.
I would be happy to save every life we could save, obviously.
But you understand that there's always a trade-off, and that sometimes it's you can't make the world perfect. You understand that? EPA can't make the world perfect. You don't control the Chinese. You don't control a lot of parts of the world. You can't even make the United States perfect, can you?
Right. Hopefully that's not the mission of the agency.
Well, it sure seems like you want to make it perfect because you want to wipe out everything related to coal as far as those of us in the coal industry and areas are concerned, and you're killing jobs left and right with no regard for what's going to happen to the people in those areas. And when you raise the cost of electricity, it doesn't appear to me that you have any regard for the cost of the people who have to pay those heat bills and those electric bills who cannot afford to do so. And I had a manufacturer in my district here this morning. I stepped out to talk to him, and I said that's what we were looking at, and that's what we were talking about today. And they said, please don't let that happen. We can't afford to be any less competitive than we are right now with our foreign competitors, et cetera. So this is why you're getting so much concern from this committee today. And I appreciate your testimony, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
This time I recognize the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Terry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you being up here. It's always interesting. I have a public power in my district, and they have, for the metropolitan area, 2 different coal-fired plants, both of which will have to be upgraded for the MACT rule, and then, of course, layer on there the inclusion in Casper. But I just want to talk about the MACT rule right now. They estimate, again, they're just guessing a range of 450 to 500 million per unit, 2 units. So we're talking about $1 billion. They estimate in their published documents that they've given both the press and me, that would relate to about a 12%, a little over 12% rate increase. So I just lay that out because it's complete. I mean, that's from 3% to 12% rate increase is a huge difference in swing between the EPA's estimates. The other issue that seems from them and other utility companies that they've expressed to me is the 3 years. Not only in the fact that there's a limited number of companies that have the expertise and the tradespeople necessary to do that, but now they have to compete against each other, and that drives up the cost of the bids. Have you taken that into account at all, that by trying to compact all of the construction into a 3-year period, that you're actually driving up the cost, and if we extended it out maybe 3 or 4 years, or 4 or 5 years, that we could eliminate some of the angst and anxiety?
Yeah, we looked at actually at both issues. We looked at costs associated with the rule and what the impact that might have on retail electricity prices. We're more than happy to work with and through the APPA, which we have met with, and with those companies in that region. We provided a lot more flexibility in the final rule because of comments we received in the proposal. We think there's a lot more flexibility in terms of controls and compliance strategies that should significantly lower the cost associated with compliance. We also looked at the timing. We're forward-leaning on the 4th year for states. We've also provided an additional 5th year opportunity for reliability critical units. We know that this is a challenge, and we'll work with the regions as well as the local communities to make sure that we can get this done well.
Yeah, and on the reliability critical unit, which are the only ones that are eligible for the 5th year, as I understand, that's right?
Yes.
Okay, and the EPA issues an administrative order that the plant can operate for a 5th year. The EPA guarantee that the plant will not be subject to citizen suits?
No, you're asking a very complicated question. We cannot guarantee that. However, this is an administrative vehicle that we have used many thousands of times. And we believe that because it's a year, that the process that we're going through for the administrative order will be transparent and will be rigorous, that we believe that there would be limited opportunity or likelihood of civil suits that would follow.
When could these companies that are requesting a fourth year or a fifth year, if it's a reliable critical unit, when will they know that they've got that extra time?
That's a very good question as well. And what we tried to signal in the enforcement policy was the sooner we have these discussions, the better. We're working with the RTOs and the planning agencies to gather the compliance plans and to assess what will be necessary for reliability. And the agency has indicated that we will provide a signal to that company about the eligibility of that administrative order so that they'd be able to rely on it with certainty to make their investments as soon as possible, well in advance
Would that be
of the
this year?
non-compliance. Well, it will take a while for the compliance plans to be done and for the reliability assessments. But as soon as they're ready, we're ready and working with DOE and FERC to assess those applications and make those decisions quickly.
All right. Again, on getting some extra time, there's also a phrase in the rule or the order that said that disclaims that anything can change at any time. And so if somebody is even granted an extra year or a fifth year if it's a reliability critical unit, they already know that anything can change without even public notice. I don't think that provides a level of certainty, and I would like the EPA to go back and look at that disclaimer.
Let me look at that qualification. I think we are trying to make sure that we communicate effectively and we work with folks to provide a certain investment path forward. We will do everything we can to be able to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Terry, and I think we've concluded with questions. And Ms. McCarthy, thank you very much for taking time to join us, and we look forward to seeing you again real soon.
Thank you, Mr.
As soon as
Chairman.
possible.
Thank you, members.
And now I'd like to call up the second panel. We have seven witnesses on the second panel. First, Mr. Darren McDonald, Director of Energy, Gerdau Long Steel, North America. Mr. Harrison Sozi, Attorney General, Navajo Nation. Dr. Julia Goodman from Harvard School of Public Health. Dr. Ann Smith, PhD economist with Narrow Economic Consulting. Mr. Ralph Robertson, President of RMB Consulting and Research. Reverend Michael Hescox, President and CEO, Evangelical Environmental Network. And Dr. Josh Bivens, Acting Research and Policy Director of the Economic Policy Institute. So we appreciate all of you being with us this afternoon. And I'm going to recognize each one of you for the period of 5 minutes for you to give your opening statements. And then at the end of that time, we'll have questions for you or some of you. So once again, thanks for being with us. And Mr. McDonald, we'll begin with you. So I'll recognize you for a period of 5 minutes for an opening statement. And I would just remind all of you to be sure and pull the microphone close and push the button to make sure that it's on, because the transcriber has difficulty hearing if it's not on. So Mr. McDonald, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the chairman of the subcommittee, Mr. Whitfield, for the opportunity to testify regarding EPA's utility MACT rule and its impact on our company, the steel sector, and the manufacturing sector in general, as we all attempt to recover from the Great Recession. I ask that my full written statement be placed in the record. My name is Darren McDonald. I'm the Director of Energy for Gerdau's 17 steelmaking facilities in the U.S. Gerdau employs 10,000 people in the U.S. and is the second largest steel recycler in North America. My responsibility at Gerdau is to secure a reliable, cost-effective energy supply and manage the company's energy efficiency strategy. Like all energy-intensive manufacturers, energy is a significant input cost for Gerdau and a key consideration when making investment decisions. The steel sector is concerned about the tremendous disagreement regarding the increased costs and reliability impacts that may result from the utility MACT. The simple fact is that all of the reliability risks and all of the compliance costs will be ultimately passed on to us, the consumers. Now, let me be clear, the U.S. manufacturing sector is doing everything we can to be energy efficient and reduce our costs. In fact, in a recent DOE study, they concluded the U.S. steel industry was the most energy efficient in the world, and only a new breakthrough technology could make a significant improvement in energy intensity. So there's no silver bullet for us to address increased energy costs or reliability impacts associated with the rule. Although the EPA has projected the utility MACT will not have a significant impact on reliability and only have a modest impact on the price of electricity, other reputable organizations disagree with these estimates. NERA has looked at the full suite of EPA's proposed regs on the utility sector and have estimated that electricity prices in some regions will increase by double digits. Others, such as Credit Suisse and NERC, have found that there will be significant cost and reliability issues. To give you some idea of the sensitivity of the manufacturing sector to an increase in electricity costs, a 1 cent per kilowatt hour increase in the cost of electricity imposes additional costs of approximately $9 billion per year on the manufacturing sector. Reliability is also a significant concern. Please recognize that large manufacturers with interruptible contracts are the first to be called upon if there is a reduction in reliability. There was a case in February of 2011 when Texas had an ice storm, and our operations in Texas were curtailed far beyond our contracted limits to provide reliability so hospitals and residential consumers could maintain reliability. So if reliability is impacted, there will be direct costs on, and those will have an impact on our bottom line, our ability to meet our customer orders, but also our ability to operate safely. From a private sector perspective, we wonder if the pace of change makes sense. The timeline required by the utility MACT rule will put a significant demand on suppliers and installers of pollution control equipment, and utilities will have no choice but to pay these heightened market rates. And these extraordinary costs will simply be passed through to ratepayers. We believe that it's in the best interest of the manufacturing sector for the EPA to phase in the utility MACT rule over a longer period of time to alleviate the combined impact the regulations will have on electricity costs and on reliability. A delay will also give time for utilities to avoid what appears to be an over-reliance on natural gas. Natural gas has had a history of volatility, but itself is the subject of potential new regulation that could drive up those costs. So let me be clear, I'm not here today to say that the EPA should do nothing with respect to improving environmental regulations. We share the environmental goals involved in many of the regulatory efforts, but the timeline is too tight and the potential extensions for utility compliance are too uncertain. If the regulation is implemented in a thoughtful and systematic way with sufficient time, then compliance and environmental gains will impose less of a concentrated impact on reliability and on the economy. Policymakers must understand that we are exposed to global competition. Risks of higher prices and reliability impacts will inevitably affect the economy, investment decisions, and the levels of employment that are sustainable in the U.S. If our customers can't afford the products made here in the U.S., the replacement products will come from somewhere else with a larger emissions footprint. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. And at this time, I recognize Mr. Ralph Robertson, President of RMB Consulting, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you and speak to you about the American Energy Initiative. My name is Ralph Robertson, and I'm president of RMB Consulting and Research. I personally have over 40 years of experience in measuring air pollution and evaluating the ability of pollution control technologies to meet emission limits. Let me begin by saying that I'm not representing any of RMB's clients today, and the views that I express are mine and not necessarily indicative of any of my clients, and I'm not receiving any compensation for this testimony. My testimony addresses EPA's recently promulgated, by now we know, MATS rule. That rule addresses emissions of hazardous air pollutants from electric generating units. My testimony is that the emission limits in the MATS rule, which EPA developed under the Maximum Achievable Control Technology provisions, or MACT provisions of the Clean Air Act, are so stringent that no new coal-fired generating unit can be built. The stringency of these new unit standards means that no generating unit can be built in this country. In effect, EPA has adopted standards that prevent our country from building any new coal units. Thus, coal-fired units will no longer be an option for the utility industry's generation portfolio. Note that my comments and testimony do not include the category of facilities called integrated gasification combined cycle, as they are regulated under a different rule. I'm addressing conventional coal-fired units. Power companies have always relied on a diverse set of resources in order to ensure that the industry can provide electricity to their customers at stable prices. Coal has always played a role in that because it's a domestic fuel, and over the long term, it's always been available at predictable cost. Banning new coal generating units would represent a significant shift in U.S. energy policy in the way that utilities have planned their portfolios, with potential significant consequences for us, the electric consumers. As I explained in my comments on the proposed rule, there's several reasons why I believe what I'm telling you. First, no unit actually achieves all of the new unit emission limits. Second, EPA based its new unit limits on selected short-term stack tests that are not representative of long-term performance and are inconsistent with the 30-day rolling average provisions that the rule requires. Third, some of the emission limits in the final rules are so low that they are below our ability to measure them accurately. In the final rule, and in response to comments on the proposed rule that no existing unit met all of the new unit limits, EPA said it has identified a source that did meet all the limits, even though that source was not identified in the preamble of the final rule. We've heard Ms. McCarthy say it today, and my testimony is that unit is Logan Generating Unit 1. EPA used Logan 1 to set the new unit limits for HCl and mercury. And EPA now says that Logan can in fact meet all the new unit limits. But please consider the following facts. Publicly available data show the results of 6 separate HCl tests for Logan. In only one of those tests did Logan meet the limits that EPA has set for HCl. It failed the other 5 times. In other words, EPA is requiring all new units to meet an HCl standard based solely on the performance of Unit 1 when that unit itself failed to meet the standard in 5 out of 6 tests. An identical situation exists for the Chamber's cogeneration Unit 2. Unit 2 was selected by EPA to support the final filterable PM limit, or particulate matter. However, 6 publicly available stack test results for Chambers exist, and only 1 out of those 6 meet the limits. EPA's selective use of these test results undermines EPA's conclusion that new units can meet the new unit limits. If the best performing unit for HCl fails the test 5 out of 6 times, and the best performing filterable limit unit fails the filterable limit 5 out of 6 times, how can it be concluded that these standards are achievable? Taking all these problems together, I'm convinced that no air pollution control vendor will provide guarantees that its equipment can meet these stringent limits. Absent those guarantees, developers will not be able to attain the huge amount of financing that it takes to build one of these projects. And absent such financing, no units will go forward. In sum, the standards set forth for new coal units in the MATS rule are so stringent that new units, even using the best technology available on the market, cannot comply. These standards therefore prevent new coal-fired units from coming into existence. Thank you.
Thank you. This time, Mr. Sozi, Attorney General for the Navajo Nation. You're recognized 5 minutes.
Yate, Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for allowing the Navajo Nation an opportunity to present its views concerning the recent EPA utility MACT rule pertaining to mercury emissions from electric generating facilities. My name is Harrison Sosi, and I'm the Attorney General of the Navajo Nation. As the Chief Legal Officer for the Navajo Nation, I have an extensive background in matters pertaining to the implementation of various federal laws and regulations on the Navajo Nation. In order to fully understand the effects of the MACT rule on the economy and its impact on consumers, I will provide a brief history of the Navajo Generating Station to illustrate how complex these issues can be. NGS was authorized by Congress to provide power for the pumps of the Central Arizona Project. Congress authorized the Central Arizona Project in 1968 through the Colorado River Basin Project Act. The purpose of the CAP is to provide the state of Arizona with access to the annual 2.8 million acre-feet of entitlement to the Colorado River. Simultaneously, the Act authorized the Department of Interior to enter into cooperative agreements with non-federal entities to build a power plant to provide power to the Central Arizona Project and to augment the Lower Colorado River Basin Development Fund, which is used to fund Indian water rights settlement claims. The result is a 24.3% ownership in the Navajo Generating Station by the U.S. government. NGS is unique because of its federal ownership stake and the plant being sited on Indian lands and uses Indian resource as a fuel source. Therefore, the federal government has certain trust responsibilities to safeguard the economy of the Navajo Nation. The U.S. EPA held no tribal consultation prior to ruling on the MACT as required by the administrative executive order on tribal consultations. Further, there are no health studies on the Navajo Nation regarding mercury. There is no mercury baseline studies to determine if there will be health improvements by the rule. The cost of compliance with regulations has a cumulative impact. While the U.S. EPA says the MACT rule will not force closure of power plants, it is the sum of all of its regulations that could do just that. The Navajo Nation has already experienced the impact of the Mojave Generating Station closure, resulting in job and revenue loss to the Navajo Nation. Roughshod regulatory policies and implementation without full analysis and tribal consultation will result in the possible closure of other facilities. Closures mean massive job losses on the Navajo Nation, which is already faced with an unemployment rate of 50%. A closure of NGS would also mean the forfeiture of $20.5 billion in gross state products to the Arizona economy and just under $680 million in adjusted state tax revenues during the years 2011 to 2044 according to recent studies. The U.S. federal government set up the Navajo Nation economy as a natural resource economy. The federal government holds title to Indian lands. Therefore, they control the economy on the Navajo Nation. As a result of the federal overregulation and control of Indian lands, there is no economy existing on hardly any Indian lands. Indian nations are often cited as being pockets of poverty throughout this great nation, and the one common denominator is the pervasive federal control. The United States EPA MACT ruling is no exception and adds yet another regulatory burden tribes are left to contend with. While some testifying today might espouse the affordability of the MACT rule implementation and the net job creation following EPA's regulatory action, the facts on the ground do not support these assertions and provide little comfort for the 1,000 plus workers employed by the various plants and the mines, in addition to the over 7,000 Navajo Nation employees that are funded in part by the revenues created by these operations. When the barrage of regulatory burdens hits home, the Navajo Nation is left with little recourse but to investigate the exportation of our abundant coal reserves to outside interests like China and India. This will only be the only method by which the Navajo Nation in the short term can maintain its economy. The Navajo Nation supports the goal of reducing hazardous emissions. We recommend a tailored implementation of any environmental rule. In the case of the MACT ruling, appropriate analysis and consideration of the economic impacts to the Navajo Nation did not occur. The MACT implementation should be fair and reasonable, taking into account compliance timelines, and must consider impacts on the Navajo economy, Indian water rights settlements, and the overall price tag that will be passed on to the electric utility consumers in the Southwest and the cap water users throughout the state of Arizona.
Thank you. At this time, Reverend Hescox, who's president of the Evangelical Environmental Network, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Whitfield and Ranking Member Rush and all the members of the committee. I must say my biggest challenge here this morning, being an old preacher, is to keep this to 5 minutes. Life, especially protecting our unborn children and infants, should not be a matter of party or economic commodity. Speaker Boehner spoke those words just a couple of weeks ago in my hearing at the March for Life rally. He suggested protecting life and providing the opportunity for abundant life must be a matter of principle and morality. Children are a precious gift from God. They are among the most vulnerable members of our society, and our Scripture demands that we protect the vulnerable. And yet we gather here today to choose if protecting our unborn children and newborns from mercury emitted from coal-burning power plants is in our national interest and keeping with our national character. Are we as a nation willing to protect our children or hinder them? Mercury is a neurotoxin whose impacts on the unborn and newborn children pose significant costs to both them and society. A recent medical paper states that mercury is a highly toxic element and there is no known safe level of exposure. In the past year, the National Association of Evangelicals, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, and us, the EEN, the Evangelical Environmental Network, have joined together to support a federal mercury standard that would protect our unborn children and infants across the country. Two different Christian traditions united to protect a sacred gift from God, a gift before and after birth. And anything that threatens and impedes life for unborn and infants is contrary to our common belief and exacts a moral cost of the nation's character. Approximately 1 in 6 children in the United States are born with threatening levels of mercury. Mercury impairs neurological development, lowers IQ, and has a potential list of other health impacts. And there are over 1,000 documented published medical journals that support these conclusions. These conditions result from eating food containing methylmercury, primarily contaminated fish, and the source of 50% of our domestic mercury emissions remain coal-fired utilities. Unborn children and infants are at risk. Pregnant women who consume fish contaminated with mercury transmit such mercury to their unborn children. And they also give it to them in their breast milk. And unlike adults, unborn children have no way to excrete mercury. The toxin keeps circulating inside their mother's womb, increasing their exposure. Medical research indicates that mercury cord blood is twice that of the mother's blood. Therefore, even if a mother's blood remains below toxic levels, risk levels, the unborn child may not. Right now, according to the latest survey, over 50% of our fresh waters in the United States have mercury fish eating advisories. It is simply not safe to eat freshwater caught fish in most of the United States. Example of that is one of my employees, one of my staff, Ben Lowe, lives in Illinois. Many of his neighbors feed fish regularly to provide protein for their families. And Ben tells a story of one day he was fishing in the Chicago River. He knew it was polluted, knew it was filled with mercury. And he was about ready to throw his catch back in when a man came up to him and asked him if he could have it. Ben tried to explain to him that it was full of mercury and other toxins. But the man said, "I need to feed my family, they're hungry." Ben gave him the fish, but it's not right. Nowhere in America should a man have to choose to feed his family or to feed them poison. Our children pay the greatest cost of mercury pollution, but such costs also accrue to society. One study estimates that the cost for methylmercury alone was $5.1 billion in 2008. The authors of that study compare the economic benefits of eliminating mercury pollution to the benefits gained from past lead regulation. We've heard today over and over again that MACT will cost $9.6 billion a year. But I believe with these kind of benefits that aren't even included in EPA studies, that for every $1 spent, we'll see $5 to $10 in return. It's going to be expensive. We estimate an internal EEN study that it could cost in the high area $7 a month to electricity bills. You've heard the averages here before. But I think that $84 a year is worth protecting our family. I know I'm probably running out of time, so I'd just like to say and conclude by that as this stance bill was released early this year, we stood together with the U.S. Catholic Conference. Bishop Blair stated upon the MACT release that the U.S. Catholic bishops welcome this important move by the administration to adopt long-awaited standards to reduce mercury and air toxic pollution from power plants and to protect our children's health. We believe together that this is a fair and uniform standard to address a powerful threat. We can take 90% of the mercury away from coal-burning power plants without the fear of diminished electricity reliability or job loss, and with great economic ability. It's well past time to act. No more delays, no more special treatment of one industry over another. Not caring for our children simply diminishes our nation. And as the psalmist says, give justice to the weak and maintain the rights of the afflicted. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
This time, we recognize Dr. Julia Goodman from the Harvard School of Public Health, and you're recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, and thank you for the opportunity to testify. I'm Dr. Julie Goodman, a board-certified toxicologist and principal at Gradient, which is an environmental...
Is your microphone on?
Is it? Can you?
Yeah, it's okay. Thank you.
Should I start again? Or?
Yeah.
Thanks. All right. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, and thank you for the opportunity to testify. I am Dr. Julie Goodman, a board-certified toxicologist and principal at Gradient, which is an environmental consulting firm in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I also teach a graduate-level epidemiology class at the Harvard School of Public Health. I'm presenting testimony this morning on my own behalf and as an independent scientist. I want to start by stressing how important clean air is. There is no doubt that high levels of pollution can be detrimental to human health and the environment. But considering everything from infant mortality to life expectancy, negative impacts from air pollution are at their lowest levels in recent history in the United States. EPA has estimated that the mercury and air toxic standards, also known as the utility MACT, will lead to benefits from reductions in health effects ranging from bronchitis to mortality, and that these benefits translate to tens of billions of American dollars saved. But the methods used to derive these benefits are fraught with large uncertainties, which likely resulted in a large overestimation of benefits. Despite its name, the vast majority of the benefits from the mercury and air toxic standards reported by EPA are not from mercury reductions, but rather from highly imprecise estimates of mortality reductions from decreasing emissions of fine particulate matter, or PM2.5. Importantly, these estimates are not based on an evaluation of all available relevant science. Rather, EPA relied on 2 observational epidemiology studies conducted when air pollution levels were generally above current standards. Epidemiology studies investigate statistical associations or correlations between estimated levels of air pollutants and health outcomes in human populations. The 2 studies on which EPA relied reported statistical associations between PM2.5 reductions and health benefits and assumed a causal relationship. But dozens of other epidemiology studies are available, and many report no such correlations. The fact that EPA only considered studies that suggested an association means that it conducted a biased assessment of the available data. And even if it were appropriate to rely only on these 2 studies, just because 2 factors are correlated does not mean that one caused the other. Study outcomes can depend on many factors. For example, health risk factors such as smoking, exercise, and diet may have contributed to the increased mortality some studies attributed to PM2.5. In addition, most epidemiology studies, including the 2 on which EPA relied, estimated personal exposure from monitors at central sites, even though most people spend the majority of their time indoors. These monitors do not accurately capture daily variations in PM2.5 concentrations or composition that are experienced by individuals, particularly indoors. This also leads to inaccurate results in epidemiology analyses. Finally, in addition to ignoring much of the epidemiology evidence, EPA did not consider other lines of evidence in its benefits estimations. Experimental studies have demonstrated that the physiological impacts of inhaling PM2.5 are only observed when very high doses overwhelm the lungs' natural defense mechanisms. In other words, the body's natural defenses can effectively deal with a certain level of PM 2.5. Above that level, called the threshold, additional PM 2.5 can perturb normal function. Indeed, some level of PM 2.5 in ambient air is unavoidable and has been present on Earth for eons, but humans have evolved the means to cope with these exposures without major health consequences. Despite this, EPA assumed that there is no level of PM 2.5 below which health effects, including mortality, would not be observed. Although EPA acknowledged that the benefits estimate would be significantly overestimated if a threshold was incorporated in its analysis, it nonetheless calculated benefits without one. If a threshold were accounted for, mortality estimates would be much less and could be zero. In conclusion, the largest benefits from the mercury and air toxic standards are derived not from reducing mercury, but from reducing PM 2.5. Despite the vast array of peer-reviewed scientific literature on the topic, EPA based its calculations on only 2 epidemiology studies. These 2 studies had several methodological limitations, including the inability to assess alternative causes of the observed health effects and the reliance on central monitors to estimate personal exposures. These studies were not consistent with many epidemiology studies indicating no correlation between reducing PM 2.5 and health benefits, nor experimental studies indicating an exposure threshold below which PM 2.5 is not likely to overwhelm the body's natural defenses. All of these factors indicate that the benefits estimates from the mercury and air toxic standards are grossly inflated and not realistic. Because there is arguably very limited evidence that these standards would reduce the disease burden more than pollution standards already in place, resources should be used towards other measures that would more clearly benefit society. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Goodman. At this time, I recognize Dr. Josh Bivens, who's Acting Director at the Economic Policy Institute, for 5 minutes.
I thank the House Subcommittee and especially the Chairman and Ranking Member for the invitation to testify today. I'm Josh Bivens, an economist at the Economic Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm going to focus on a relatively narrow slice of the issue, which is the short-run job impacts of the toxics rule. This is a narrow part of the issue, but it has started to become a major part of the debate. And this is understandable. Far too many Americans remain jobless nearly 4 years after the bursting housing bubble led to what is now known as the Great Recession. And further, I think it's, the entanglement of this debate of the toxics rule with this current crisis of joblessness is why I actually began writing about this rule. On the topic of job creation and economic performance, especially in the short run, this is my area of expertise. And further, I think it's safe to say that no other research institute in Washington, D.C. has worried more loudly and publicly about the current crisis of joblessness than the Economic Policy Institute. Nobody has stronger bona fides in demanding that policymakers address the unacceptably high unemployment rates of the past couple of years. So in short, I took very seriously any claim that a given policy could actually inflict some harm in the labor market. But looking at the toxics rule with an eye towards making sure that the current crisis of joblessness is not exacerbated, I found nothing to concern me on the jobs front. In fact, I found that the jobs impact of the toxics rule in the next couple of years is going to be modest, positive. It's not a jobs bill. It's a bill to improve health and quality of life. It also happens to have modest, positive job impacts. In my testimony, my written testimony, which I request be submitted into the record, draws heavily on research I authored for EPI. I sketch out how regulatory changes in general and the toxics specifically can impact unemployment. I conclude a couple things. One, the air toxics rule, like almost all regulatory changes, will have only negligible impacts on job growth over the longer run, and that in the shorter run, especially in an economy plagued by too high rates of unemployment like the American economy today, its impact is very likely to be positive. The major findings of my research is I do a couple different methodologies. My best estimate is that the impacts of the rule will be to create about 100,000 jobs between now and 2015. And so for the rest of my testimony, I'm just going to briefly describe some of the economic mechanisms that I take into account in making this, and then I'm of course, happy to take questions. So basically, if you want to think about the effect of regulatory changes on job creation, you really want to separate two things. The long run, when the economy is functioning pretty well, versus the short run, when the economy is not functioning well. Employment over the long run in a well-functioning economy, basically, regulatory changes are going to have no impact on employment in that case. And the reason is pretty simple. When the economy is functioning well, the Federal Reserve has a great ability to neutralize any boost or reduction in job growth through its conventional monetary policy. We may criticize the Fed for their specific unemployment or inflation targets, but when the economy is functioning well, they hit them. So whatever the effective regulation does to the unemployment rate when the economy is functioning well, the Fed can just push back on it either way. Further, the impact of the regulatory changes on the first round impacts even before the Fed gets involved, they're going to be pretty modest because they're cross-cutting. Basically, you're going to see some job growth because of the investments that need to be undertaken to install the pollution abatement and control equipment that is going to clean the air. And then on the other side, you're going to see a slight rise in the overall price level as energy costs are then perhaps passed on in the form of higher prices to consumers. But they're cross-cutting effects. They're going to be modest. There isn't even going to be that hard for the Fed to push back against them. And in a well-functioning economy, the Fed will be able to do so. We know that's not the case in the economy today. The Fed is unable to push the unemployment rate lower. It's been trying for a long time, and it can't. And so that means, you know, in the jargon, we call it the economy stuck in a liquidity trap. We have very high rates of unemployment, even with short-term interest rates absolutely stuck at zero. The Federal Reserve is essentially disarmed in its conventional policy, and that changes the analysis of regulatory changes. So basically, you've got, I would say, a positive, a negative, and a neutral effect to this rural unemployment. The positive is jobs gained through investments in pollution abatement and control equipment. The roughly neutral is jobs in the utility sector themselves, and then the negative is the job impacts of higher energy costs being passed on to higher prices, and thus reducing consumer demand. I'm just going to say a couple reasons why in an economy with a very large unemployment rate, with a very high unemployment rate and large output gaps, that last negative factor is not going to be as strong. I mean, first, the bulk of cost impacts of the toxic rule on electricity prices are temporary, reflecting the need for utilities to make upfront investments in cleaner generation. Vast body of economic research says households don't respond very much to temporary price increases. Second, it's likely that any upward price pressure stemming from regulatory changes in the current environment are going to be very blunted because of the very large output gap in the economy. Basically, firms don't have pricing power. When they're not running factories full bore, when they're not selling enough stuff, they just don't have much pricing power to pass on a higher cost to consumers. We know that they have a very large profit margins today. Pre- and post-tax profit margins are at their highest rates in over 40 years. They have a very large buffer with which they can absorb any cost increase, especially one as modest as that stemming from the toxics rule. And lastly, even if prices do rise slightly in response to the toxics rule, this could actually be a benefit in the current economy. What we have right now is nominal interest rates that the Fed controls are stuck at zero. And so as prices fall, that actually makes real interest rates rise. That's the last thing we want in the economy right now. We don't want to increase borrowing costs for firms. And so anything that pushes back against disinflationary pressures could actually be good for the economy. I would just conclude by saying the claim that regulatory changes in general are responsible for today's continued economic weakness don't have any empirical foundation. The claim that regulatory changes should be expected to slow economic and employment growth in the future lacks any basis in economic theory or evidence. And normally, regulatory changes are pretty neutral in their impacts on employment. Actually, the poor performance of the economy today is a reason to make sure that the toxics rule is actually implemented as planned.
I'll let you go over a minute. So, next, our witness is Dr. Ann Smith. I'm sorry, Ann, from the NERA Consulting Group, Economic Consulting, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me. I am Ann Smith. My statements today are my own opinions and do not reflect the views of my company, NERA Economic Consulting. The MATS rule is costly and will create net harm to the economy without providing any meaningful reduction of risk from the hazardous air pollutants, or HAPs, that are its sole purpose. No matter how costly, EPA must set MACT rules based on the assessed risk from the HAPs. However, EPA lacks evidence that the utility HAPs pose meaningful risks. And EPA is masking that fact in its regulatory impact analysis, or RIA, with estimates of so-called co-benefits from coincidental reductions of PM 2.5, which is not a HAP and which EPA is already required to regulate to safe levels. EPA estimates the MATS rule will avoid up to 11,000 premature deaths and many other respiratory and heart ailments, creating benefits of $33 billion to $90 billion per year, which compare to EPA's cost estimate of about $10 billion per year. First, those benefits have nothing to do with the HAPs at all. All of the lives saved and virtually all of the dollar benefits are from coincidental reductions of already safe levels of PM 2.5. The estimated benefits from HAP reductions are 10,000 times smaller than the PM 2.5 co-benefits. Lost to rounding error. It's solely due to the mercury reductions under this complex rule as well. The mercury-related benefit is so low because EPA estimates the rule will improve IQ of exposed children by an average of only 0.002 IQ points. That change is not even measurable in actual IQ testing. EPA nevertheless assumes it reduces their lifetime earnings to generate those tiny mercury benefits. The story is even worse for requiring MACT on acid gases from utilities. This part of the rule accounts for about half of the $10 billion price tag, and EPA has not identified any actual health risk associated with current emissions of acid gases from power stations. That leaves only co-benefits. In a report I completed last December, I explained why EPA's practice of justifying new rules using co-benefits is wrong, and show how the PM 2.5 co-benefits are overstated to the point of implausibility. For example, EPA's estimates of 11,000 lives saved under the MATS rule from coincidental PM 2.5 reduction is based on assumptions that also imply that about 25% of all deaths nationwide were due to PM 2.5 back in 1980. Those assumptions stretch the bounds of credibility. Further, as I said, EPA must identify the safe level of PM 2.5 when setting the PM 2.5 National Ambient Air Quality Standard. EPA's MATS RIA shows that all of its estimated lives saved are in areas where PM 2.5 is already below that safe level. Even if EPA tightens its PM 2.5 standard to a lower level, given the range it's willing to consider for that new standard right now, 94% to nearly 100% of those 11,000 lives will still be from areas where EPA deems the PM 2.5 levels to be safe. If EPA considers those PM levels unsafe, it would have to set an even lower standard for PM 2.5. It is thus not valid to use those risk estimates to instead justify non-PM regulations such as the MATS rule. Without any meaningful risks from the HAPs themselves, and with the co-benefits both non-credible and inappropriate to consider, the economic impact of the MATS rule becomes relevant. EPA does not fully analyze the implications of spending $10 billion per year for MATS compliance. I have. Using NERA's new ERA model, I project that EPA's $10 billion cost per year implies a net loss in worker income, GDP, and consumption. Even accounting for spending on workers who will install the controls, the new ERA analysis projects a reduction in worker income that's equivalent to about 200,000 full-time jobs in 2015. RIAs are intended to provide transparency about the impacts and merits of regulations, even when a benefit cost justification is not the legal basis for setting the standard. The MATS RIA fails to serve that purpose. EPA's use of highly dubious co-benefits in its RIA for the MATS gives it a shield to justify a costly rule that it cannot justify on its own risk merits.
Thank you, Dr. Smith, and thank all of you for your testimony. Mr. Sozi, Dr. Bivens in his testimony indicated that he would anticipate maybe 100,000 job gain in the U.S. as a result of this regulation, maybe more, maybe a little less. What did you tell me the unemployment rate was in the Navajo Nation right now? Turn your microphone on, please.
Based on our studies in 2009, the unemployment rate on the Navajo Nation hovers above 50% unemployment.
And do you anticipate from the analysis that you all have conducted and from your own personal knowledge working with others that your unemployment rate is going to go down as a result of this regulation?
No. We anticipate there may be some preliminary jobs during the installation of the technology. However, there may be at most 8 jobs that are created as far as operating the technology. But the offset is not only with the MACT, but with the BART, there will be substantial costs on the generating facility, which in my mind will force the owners to shut down the plant.
And if that happens, how many jobs do you lose?
If that happens, at the Navajo Generating Station, I believe we estimated 438 jobs at the plant. There is also an associated mine that employs close to 400 people also. And that also will have a devastating effect. So we're talking approximately 1,000 jobs in addition to the additional jobs that it creates by keeping.
So you potentially really going to be hurt economically.
That's correct. We also have two facilities. The Navajo Generating Station is one example that I used. We have the Four Corners Power Plant located near Farmington, and the San Juan Generating Station also right across the river from that are going to be impacted by these regulations.
Now, Ms. McCarthy testified that EPA had been working very closely with the Navajo Nation to try to address your concerns. Are you all satisfied with the assistance you're getting from EPA?
Not on this particular rule.
Okay. Now, Dr. Goodman in her testimony and Dr. Smith in her testimony and others had indicated that in all the analysis, even EPA's analysis, shows that the benefit from mercury reduction is almost nil. And yet, the advocates of this regulation, that's all they talk about, is the benefits of mercury reductions. From your perspective as the Attorney General of the Navajo Nation, do you feel like the benefit of the mercury reduction from this bill will outweigh the negative impacts of losing jobs? Are you more concerned about mercury reduction or jobs in the Navajo Nation?
We are concerned about both. And the difficulty in the MACT rule is there's no data available that we can analyze to make an assessment. That's the ongoing difficulty. We have studied the impacts of the BART, the best available retrofit technology, on the power plants that exist. But as far as the MACT implications, we haven't generated any data, so we can't make a determination as to whether or not it's going to be good or bad.
Well, Dr. Goodman, in your analysis, you did a pretty thorough analysis on this. Did you find any dollar value in the reduction of the mercury emissions as a result of this rule?
Sorry about that. I'm not an economist, so I can't speak too much to the dollar value, but what I can say is that the science used to evaluate the mercury benefits had, the evaluation had similar issues as the PM analysis, in that there were many steps getting from the beginning to the ultimate calculation of risks, and each step had uncertainties, and these uncertainties were compounded. So by the very end, this ended up being a large overestimate, even though it still only accounts for whatever it is, 0.01% of the benefits.
Well, my understanding, Dr. Smith, and you can tell me if you disagree, and Dr. Goodman, that the benefits certainly did not come from mercury reduction. The primary benefits are coming from reduction of PM2.5. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. So I think they're very misleading about focusing on the mercury, because there's no benefit in the mercury reduction. Mr. Robertson, now you made some quite startling comments, and I know that you've worked with electric generating utilities for a long time, but are you saying that conventional coal plants cannot really be built in this country as a result of this rule because of guarantees and financing issues? Did I understand you correctly?
Yes, that is my testimony. The emission limits, the numerical emission limits in the final rule for new coal-fired units are so low that an equipment vendor could not possibly guarantee that they could meet those numbers on a consistent basis.
Yeah. Well, you know, that's really a concern, because we expect electricity demand to go up by 2035 and maybe 50%, and we're reducing our base load, and I'm concerned about our ability to compete in the global marketplace. My time has expired, and at this time I recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, for 5 minutes.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. Reverend Hescox, I'm glad that you're here. It's really refreshing for me. I'm a pastor of a church on the south side of the city of Chicago. So it's so refreshing to me to hear the voice of the priestly and the prophetic on this particular issue. and I want to thank you for being here. Why did you decide to get involved on this particular issue?
I'm an evangelical, and I'm concerned about life.
Mm.
And to me, the threat of 600,000, 15% of our unborn children suffering IQ brain damage from resolved mercury is a significant problem to me. I mean, I believe that we should stand up and protect our unborn, the least of these. And we know that mercury is a problem. You know, it's been going on for a long time. This amount of IQ damage and other things, our waters are filled with it. I have pastors in Pennsylvania where I live. I live in the state that produces the third amount most of mercury, who used to fish for their children, who won't even take their children fishing anymore because they're scared of mercury poisoning. So I'm here because it's a life issue. For us, creation care, I mean, I'm not an environmentalist. I am a Christian who believes that God gave us a planet, the creation, for sustainable life. And things like mercury pollution are making the planet not sustainable, and especially impacts those we can't protect at all.
Well, your organization is not the only religious organization that's involved on this issue. Can you talk about the other organizations? And
Sure, and with us together, I have a representative from the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops is right behind me. At least I hope she's still here. Also, the National Association of Evangelicals have joined us, and there are probably other Christian groups involved. We happen to be two groups that are pro-life groups, and so it was very easy for the NAE and the Catholic bishops to join together with us to stand up for the rights of the unborn.
Now, you've been very patient with us, and you've been here from the beginning, and I'm sure you've probably paid attention to the discourse, the debate on both sides over a number of months, if not years. And we seem to be going back and forth, never moving forward, just going back and forth in what I might call a circular firing squad. We're just, no forward advancement here. What do you think we're missing here in terms of the point? Why can't we move forward? What's the element that we're missing here, in your opinion, that we are failing to appreciate, that we have eyes that don't see, and ears that don't hear? What are we missing here?
I mean, the flippant answer would be a miracle.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the reality is that I live in southern York County, Pennsylvania. I'm a Republican. I've been a Republican since I was born. York County's a Republican place. But we talk about that we need to come together as a people to solve these problems. And I think that's what I would urge us all to do. It's why, the Catholics and evangelicals don't agree on everything. But we have this common issue of protecting unborn that is very important to us. And so I guess, how do we solve it? I'd like to get you and Mr. Whitfield in a room together and say, let's work it out, and not go forward until we agree. There has to be a way to find a common interest to go forward on all these issues. And quite honestly, our country needs it. Our country needs the men and women in this Congress to find a way to work together. I mean, that's my prayer every day, that we could, the Speaker Boehner put it right. I was at the March for Life rally and walked up the hill. When he said those words that, life should not be a party or an economic issue, I stood up and cheered. Somehow we found that in 1990 when the Clean Air Act was first put into place. And I'm just asking, let's find a way to come back together again to find that. Let's find a way to work together to solve these problems.
Stop now. Yeah, I just wanted, as a pastor, and a believer. Second Chronicles 7:14. Would that have meaning for us here?
I think that we just need to come together to be people, to recognize that there are problems. We need to solve the problems. We need to get on with it and really establish America as a great place again. And I think we can do that by working together.
Thank you, Mr. Rush. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Amen. We all want to work together. Brother Rush and myself want to work together. We just have differences of opinion on what the problem is, but we definitely want to work together. And I hope someday that I come to your church and get to sit out in the congregation, if I'm allowed in the door.
No, you are allowed in the door.
I hope so.
Welcome. Not only allowed, but you'll be welcome.
I'll help the collection plate a little bit.
No, you'll be welcome.
So, I want to ask Dr. Goodman some questions. I think you were in the audience when I questioned the deputy administrator. I'm going to read you the sentence that I read her that's in the footnotes of their ruling that says, the negative estimates for certain endpoints are the result of the weak statistical power of the study used to calculate the health impacts and do not suggest that increases in air pollution exposure result in decreased health impacts. Is that sentence basically stating in one sentence what your testimony stated? That their conclusions really can't be confirmed by the true facts of the case?
Yes, I think if you look at the science as a whole, so it's epidemiology, toxicology, mechanistic studies, they don't support that reducing PM 2.5 levels, when you're already starting with low levels, reducing them even more is going to necessarily have any health benefits.
And I know that, I mean, you're the only toxicologist on the panel here. The gentleman next to you on your right, who I have great respect for because of his right to life beliefs, which I'm about a 96% right to life, lifetime voting record congressman, he's concerned about mercury poisoning in the unborn. Is it your belief as a toxicologist that the exposure levels resulting from smokestack emissions of power plants in terms of mercury does impact the unborn?
I would say that in terms of this rule, the impact on mercury emissions is going to be so negligible that it will not have a measurable impact.
A measurable impact. Okay. I want to ask the Attorney General for the Navajo Nation. You seem to be a pretty level-headed guy, and you seem to understand the real world and the impacts of on your tribe. Dr. Bivens, if I understood him correctly, I was listening in my office, says that higher electricity prices are good for the economy because it has a deflationary impact, and since factories aren't working anyway, they can't raise prices, so we ought to just go with it. Now, I'm paraphrasing, but that's, I think, a pretty close paraphrase. What's your reaction to that?
For us, for the Navajo Nation, the reaction is that it's a little different than what he's stating. The Navajo Nation is generally not the end customer for electric utility facilities. First of all, most of our people live without electricity for a long time, and we've just recently made an effort to get electricity into our households. So that's not a luxury that we've enjoyed for a long time. In addition to that, we site the facilities on Navajo lands. Our coal is used to fuel the power plants. And historically, the federal government has taken the initiative to negotiate deals on behalf of the Navajo Nation. So in essence, we've always subsidized the Southwest with below rate prices for our resources, our water, our airshed, and exemptions from our taxes. Now it has come to a point where the leases are expiring and we're renegotiating our leases. So we've come to a time frame where we will enjoy greater benefits than we have in the past. And the very economy that was established for us by the federal government is now under threat again by the federal government.
My time's expiring. I want to go back to Dr. Goodman. Can I paraphrase your testimony to say that you don't think these new rules, when implemented, will have a measurable positive impact on public health?
I think that is a definite possibility.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
This time recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Dingell, for a period of 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your courtesy. My questions are to Darren McDonald, Director of Energy, Gerdo Long Steel in North America. Mr. McDonald, you have a fine manufacturing facility in Monroe, Michigan, which is in my district. I've been there and seen it. Now, what have the Michigan utilities told you about the potential effects of the new rules on the rates that they will charge your company in Monroe for electricity?
I don't have a exact impact on the cost for from Detroit Edison or from consumers. One of the challenges is to understand what the cost will be and what technical solution they're going to be able to implement to meet the compliance deadlines.
Let's take a quick look at this, though. Electricity costs go up, and you're going to have significant problems, are you not?
Well, yes, we will.
I mean, that's very clear. And if these matters are handled improperly by the regulatory agencies, the practical result will be that the rates for electricity sold to your company will go up. Is that not so?
That's correct.
Would you have your rate people take a look at these matters and give us an answer as to how these things are going to affect you under the different possible scenarios? If the EPA hurries matters unduly, or if it treats the utilities in a proper fashion. We'd like to see how you're projecting your electrical utility costs. Now, next question. What steps will you take if rates for your Monroe facility rise excessively?
What we do on a regular basis, routinely, monthly basis, is look at the cost of.
You buy your electricity in bulk. Is that right?
Yeah, we're a regulated utility in the state of Michigan in both locations, so we buy it from the utility under a contracted rate. However, if the rates go up, what we do is look at the cost, our cost structure at each of those mills, 20 in North America, and we decide where it's least cost.
So you're going to go build somewhere else where the rates are cheaper.
Lowest cost, yes, sir.
Is that a danger to us in Monroe?
Oh, it's a decision that's made for every state we operate in.
Okay. Now, in your testimony, you recommend that legislative action be taken to phase in the requirements of the new rule over a period of time. Is that correct?
That's correct.
What do you think an appropriate period of time would be for phasing in these rates?
Well, we've been told that 3 years is too quick, and that the fourth and fifth year are subject to some application process at that time. So you get to the fourth year, you need to apply. You get to the fifth year, you need to apply. So we're looking for, utilities have told us that they were looking for a much longer window in order to properly plan and avoid the
You're
rush.
looking for them to phase them in over 4 or 5 years and hoping that would be so. Is that right?
Could you repeat the question?
I'm sorry?
Could you repeat your question? I didn't.
I said you're looking for them to phase in the new rules over 4 or 5 years as opposed to doing it in 3. Is that right?
At least 5 years.
All right, and the consequences of phasing in over 3 years would be a rapid and difficult rate increase for you. Is that right?
Well, that's correct, plus unnecessary cost because of the rush for the same resources and the same
Good.
suppliers.
Now, how many people do you have at your Monroe plant?
Roughly in the 300 range.
Okay. Do you have any plans for expansion?
Yes, we're currently planning an expansion at Monroe.
Now, what would that order of magnitude be?
From a capacity perspective, we're looking to nearly double it.
Okay. And if the rate increases go up too fast, you might find that you're going to have to rethink those plans. Is that right?
We always consider the price of electricity as
Right.
one of the key investment decisions.
Now, are there other recommendations you would make besides a longer period of time for the utilities to be able to comply with the changes that EPA is suggesting?
Yeah, we would like to see more consideration given to alternatives for fuel diversity. We're concerned about all the eggs in a single natural gas basket.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, you've been very gracious. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. This time, I recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimquist, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to direct most of my questions and comments to Reverend Hiscox. It's interesting how in this profession and in this committee that I'm always drawn to theological debates and discourse, which I think my friends on the other side like to draw me into. But I'm not afraid. And so with that, let's, Dr. Hiscox, the phrase conceived and bore is used repeatedly in Genesis 4:1 and Genesis 4:17. And the individual has the same identity before and as after birth. In the quotations, in sin my mother conceived me, the repentant psalmist says in Psalm 51, verse 7. The same word is used for the child before and after birth. That word is brephos, that is infant. It's used in Luke 1, verse 41, and Luke 18, verse 15. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Thank you. God knows the preborn child. I also quote, you knit me in my mother's womb, nor was my frame unknown to you when I was made in secret. Psalm 139, 13 through 15. God also helps and calls the preborn child, and I quote, you have been my guide since I was first formed. From my mother's womb you are my God. Psalm 22, verses 10 through 11. And I also quote, God from my mother's womb had set me apart and called me through his grace. And that's from St. Paul to the church of Galatia, 1 verse 15. Now, the term, the pro-life community, well, first of all, there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 pieces of legislation promoted by the pro-life community in this Congress. Has your organization endorsed any of them?
We endorse the whole effort and do that as far as the right to life.
So you have officially endorsed H.R. 3?
Not officially.
H.R. 374? And have you officially endorsed any defined pro-life legislation in this Congress? I mean, it's a simple yes or no. Have you or have you not?
No.
Okay, that's not unexpected. Why do I ask that question?
Yeah, why do you?
The life in pro-life denotes not the quality of life, but life itself. The term denotes opposition to a procedure that intentionally results in dead babies. So that's why we in the pro-life community take great offense when an evangelical movement tries to usurp the meaning of pro-life when it's defined. Those in the pro-life community believe life is distinct, unique, at conception to natural
death. That's what the pro-life community stands for. And I'd like to submit for the record testimony of Dr. Timothy D. Terrell, Associate Professor of Economics, Wolford College, and Senior Fellow at Cornwall. And I'd also like to submit a statement, and I've quoted some of it, protecting the unborn and the pro-life movement from misleading environmentalist tactic, a joint statement by pro-life leaders. I'd like to submit that into the record.
Subject.
Because as has been testified here by the toxicologists, you're basing your religious movement and assuming the pro-life mantle when even the toxicologist testifies that there is little to no harm. Little to no harm. Now, the pro-life community is about life. It's not about levels of harm or no harm. We are there to protect the life of the unborn child.
Mr. Shimkus, are you going to allow me to respond?
I think I'm doing pretty good right now. Thank you. So
I figured as much.
First and foremost, truly pro-life issues are issues of actual life and death. That's the pro-life community, which you are masquerading for an environmental cause, which I reject, and which many in the pro-life community, and I'm sorry that I've had to take this time to set the record straight. And with that, I yield back my time.
I feel that you have just attacked my
Mr. Chairman,
sir, and I really am
Mr. Chairman,
upset at that.
Regular order.
Just a minute. Just a minute. What did the gentleman have said?
I just called for regular order.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
There's been some very heated words here and some accusations, and I think that this witness has come from far, and he's been very patient. And unfortunately, my friend from Illinois has leveled some real harsh charges at him that goes to the core of what he believes in and what he works for. So I just think that the committee should, out of common courtesy, allow him to respond.
Well, I'm not going to allow him to respond because we ask questions all the time. Sometimes we give people an opportunity to respond. Sometimes we don't.
Mr. Chairman,
we have 5 or 6 members over here.
Mr. Chairman,
I'll recognize Mr. Waxman.
Mr. Chairman, point of order. Yes. I would like to then officially request that we have a second round of questioning.
I don't have any, no. Okay, I don't have any objection to that. That's fine. Mr. Waxman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. According to EPA, the mercury air toxic standards will generate up to $90 billion in health benefits each year, far outweighing the cost of compliance. EPA estimates that this rule will create jobs as well. Dr. Bivens, in your testimony, you state that, quote, there is no better time than now from a job-creating perspective to move forward with these rules, end quote. Can you explain to us in layman's terms what you mean by this?
Yeah, I think in the longer run, in economies that are working well, regulatory changes are going to have essentially no impact on employment because basically the Federal Reserve has unemployment targets that in normal, well-functioning times they can hit so they can neutralize any change to employment coming from regulatory changes. That's not true right now. We've got the Federal Reserve. Its conventional monetary policy is maxed out, and yet we still have very high rates of unemployment. What that means is the economy needs more spending, more investment, more consumer spending, more government spending. Anything to increase spending will increase jobs. These regulatory changes will actually kick out some corporate investment. It'll make them undertake some pollution abatement and control investments they wouldn't have otherwise.
Well, many of my Republican colleagues talk about the costs of complying with EPA's rules as if the money spent on pollution controls and upgrades goes into a black hole. That simply isn't the case, is it?
That's right. I mean, one person's cost is another person's income. And so what is compliance costs from the perspective of the industry is incomes and jobs from the perspective of people installing the pollution abatement and control equipment.
How does spending on pollution control activities create jobs, both at a power plant and up the supply chain?
Basically, it's investments that firms would not have undertaken absent the mandates of the regulatory change. And so in order to make sure that they're emitting less of the hazardous air pollutions, they install things like filters and scrubbers and bag houses. These are additions to the capacity they have. They have to hire construction workers and skilled workers to install them on site. That creates jobs down in supplier industries and steel in order to make the bag houses and the scrubbers. And so it creates jobs that way. It just basically makes a lot of economic activity that wouldn't have happened happen because now it's mandated.
EPA estimated that the mercury and air toxic standards will create 46,000 short-term construction jobs and 8,000 long-term utility jobs. You argued that this is a conservative estimate and likely undercounts the job creation benefits of the new rule. How does EPA underestimate the employment benefits of the air toxics rule?
I think the biggest underestimate is that when they looked at jobs created through the pollution abatement and control investments, they didn't capture anywhere near all of the supplier jobs. And so basically, you've got the equipment that needs to be installed. They capture the jobs that install the equipment, but the supplier jobs, the steel that goes into the equipment, the drivers that are needed to bring it to site, the accountants that work for the firms that supply the equipment, they missed a lot of those supplier jobs, and I think that's the biggest source of understatement.
This committee has had numerous hearings to examine the question, big picture question of whether new regulations harm economic growth. And what we've heard from the Republicans is that regulations are slowing down the economic recovery. You conclude that this argument has no merit. Can you briefly describe why regulations are not a drag on the economy?
Sure. I would first urge people, the president of my institute had a very good paper on this about regulatory change not being the source of slow job growth. People should look for that on our website. But the big pieces of evidence are, if you look at profit margins for firms today, that they're highest in 45 years. And so it's really hard to make the case that anything, regulatory change or anything else, is sort of destroying the cost structure of firms and making them unprofitable. Yet, with very high profit margins, you don't see them producing a lot. Why don't they produce a lot? Because there's just not that many customers coming in the door. And so to me, that says when you've got very high profit margins and somehow you cannot exploit those and sell more stuff, that's not the sign that something has ruined your cost structure the way the argument the regulatory change would be. It's a sign that the economy lacks demand.
Reverend Hescox, I just came in the middle of your questioning by my colleague. And I don't know how much we can get into this, but or whether we want to, or whether I want to, but how do the real people you talk to feel about exposing children or unborn children to mercury and other toxic air pollution?
They're scared. They want to protect their children. How many people in this room want to have their children or grandchildren have 2 or 3 points lower in their IQ? I don't. I have a 9-month-old grandson who was born in Pennsylvania. We won't know for 48 months whether his IQ will be normal or not. We stand a good chance because of my work in mercury. And I mean, who hasn't gone to their physician when pregnant and told what fish not to eat and to wash your fish consumption? So I think he stands a pretty good chance. But there are a lot of people that don't stand that chance of protecting their kids. And for me, it is a pro-life issue, along with many evangelicals, that we are totally pro-life. Pro-life against poverty. Pro-life against air pollution. Certainly, first, pro-life against abortion. Number one, won't deny that in a bit. But we are totally whole life. And there is a growing number of evangelicals and Roman Catholics. And that's why we're sitting here together.
I think the Catholic Council of Bishops has endorsed the EPA rule. That's my understanding, Mr. Chairman. I just want to put that on the record.
Gentleman's time has expired. This time I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Dr. Burgess, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Robertson, you were in the audience when I was questioning Administrator McCarthy and brought up to her that under the new rule that the EPA was effectively taking coal off the table for our future energy portfolio. She was very dismissive of me in her answer. Seems like you offered additional information that perhaps that question was not one that should be so easily dismissed.
Well, it's certainly my opinion that it's not easy to dismiss. I think EPA was looking...
Is your microphone on?
Is that better?
Yep, much better.
I don't think that's a very easy issue to dismiss at all. I think EPA was looking for a simple answer that they had found a unit that meets the new unit limits, and therefore everything is fine. I think they failed to look much as far as they should have, because it's their own data of the tests that I'm talking about. It's not 5 or 6 tests that I have in my attic. It's in the EPA's own spreadsheets that shows that the Logan unit fails the HCl limit 5 out of 6 tests. The Chambers cogen unit fails the particulate test 5 out of 6 times.
And these were the units that she was referencing in her answer to me, that we already have new plants that meet the standard?
The Logan unit is the one she claims meets all of the new unit limits. And I'm saying the Logan unit is the basis for the HCl limit, but it itself doesn't even meet that limit when you look at multiple tests.
Very well. Thank you. Thank you for that answer. Reverend Hescock, let me ask you a question. It says on my my information sheet about the witnesses that your group is called the Evangelical Environmental Network. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And currently, are you all involved in any sort of media campaign or advertising campaign?
We've done some informative not currently, we did last year.
And what was your budget for that advertising?
We had a total of around $250,000.
Do you have, would it be available to the committee who has provided you the funding for that advertising?
Sure, the money came from the, I mean, it will be filed on our, whatever the right form is this year.
And maybe you could provide that to the committee?
I would be happy to provide that. All
right, I've got up on the screen a slide because Mr. Barton asked a question of Administrator McCarthy about the contribution of the United States to the global mercury emissions. And this slide is from the EPA, from their reference in the Federal Register, and they referenced this source from this paper from the Journal of Atmospheric Chemistry and Physics, that is the global mercury emissions to the atmosphere from anthropogenic and natural sources, man-made and natural sources. If you look at that slide, it looks like we could cut out all the mercury production in the United States, and we've made a minuscule effect upon global mercury production. So I would also suggest, from hearing from the other witnesses, that knocking out the entire United States contribution of mercury, which means shuttering all coal-fired power plants, could have a devastating effect upon certainly Mr. Tsui's constituents. Mr. Roberson has implied that it would be hard on people in his area. Certainly the people in Texas last winter who had the gas-fired plants shut down for a brief period of time during an ice storm would argue that there were some health effects of that. But you keep referencing the effects of mercury. I have a brief film clip that I would like to play. It's not from a right-wing group. It's from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association. Perhaps we could key that up and play that. Let's just take a listen here. And this is from NOAA. Maybe we can.
I think it's very important to be very clear that for adults, there are actually no recommendations to avoid fish that contain moderate amounts of mercury or even other contaminants. And so if somebody eats commercially purchased fish in the store and just eats a variety of fish, they don't need to worry about the very low levels of toxins that are in those fish.
Ocean fish actually are almost an ideal nutrient package for pregnancy and breastfeeding because it contains high quality protein, omega-3 fatty acids. It contains micronutrients as well as minerals and vitamins.
Women in the United States who choose not to consume fish during pregnancy or who are not consuming some kind of supplement of DHA are taking a risk for the development of their infant. They may be creating a risk for themselves as well.
During adult life, seafood is probably the single most important food you can eat for cardiovascular health, just gram for gram, calorie for calorie, because it reduces the risk of dying from heart disease by about a third.
Go ahead and stop that in the interest of time. Mr. Chairman,
we don't have any.
This is a excerpted portion from the NOAA film, and if it's okay with the committee, I'd like to put a link to the entire 25-minute segment on the committee's website so people can view that for themselves.
Absolutely.
And I'll yield back the balance of my time.
This time, Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson, for 5 minutes.
I thank the Chairman, and welcome to all the witnesses. Thank you all for testifying today.
Unfortunately, with such a large panel, I'm going to have to ask my questions in a form that requires a yes or no answer. And I ask you, as a former naval aviator, so please cover your buddy six. And if they're not hitting the microphone button, just reach over there and tap it for them. And as I mentioned, the first panel, my home state of Texas is still suffering a significant drought. The district I represent, Texas 22, went through the hottest August in history, over 100 degrees every single day in August. And still, we had 100% humidity that makes people love Houston weather in the summer. And experts predict that we're going to have the same conditions recurring this summer. ERCOT, which is the company, the organization that controls our grid for most of the state, is worried about capacity shortages if the weather reoccurs as expected. If it does happen, real lives will be lost if we have blackouts, not projected life saves that EPA uses. Real lives, real people, disproportionately impacting the young and elderly if they lose power in this excessive heat. EPA calls the proposed rule we're talking about today the quote-unquote mercury and air toxic standard. And I want to make clear that I realize that mercury is a dangerous toxin. As a 6-year-old, I broke a thermometer with mercury in the bathroom. We almost moved out of the house because of my carelessness. And EPA claims that there's going to be $90 billion per year in health benefits, and yet the benefits from decreased mercury standards is going to be $500,000. 0.5% of the total health benefits come from the reduction in mercury. And here's the question the people in Texas 22 want me to ask you all. If the EPA is using minuscule benefits, mercury benefits from, if the EPA is using minuscule benefits from reduction in mercury to increase reductions in particulate matter, PM2.5, is that what they're doing? And I'll start at the right there. Let's see. Mr. McDonald. Yes or no?
What was the question?
The question basically is, EPA, as I said, EPA says it's going to be $900 billion in health benefits. But the benefits from mercury reduction, I've got a chart here I can go into. But the benefits from mercury production are going to be $500,000. So 0.5% of all EPA benefits are going to come from mercury reduction. So the other benefits have to be coming from, in my opinion, particulate matter reductions. That's what the people at home want me to ask you. Do you think this is coming, this mercury reduction theme is a guide to get to particulate matter reduction? Yes or no?
Yes.
And Mr. Robertson, yes or no?
Yes, I do.
Okay, and Mr. Sozi?
Yes, it appears that way.
Reverend Hescott?
No.
And Dr. Goodman?
Yes.
Mr. Bivens?
No.
And finally, Dr. Smith?
Yes.
Okay, 5 yeses and 2 nos. Okay, another question. This is I want to ask. This chart, guys, just so you understand this. Did you see? And just another yes no, real quickly. Did you see this chart or have this information before you came here today? First, Mr. Donald, have you seen this before? These numbers?
I haven't seen it.
Hadn't seen it before. How about you, Mr. Robertson?
I have not seen the chart, but I'm very familiar with the numbers.
There we go. Mr. Sozi?
No, I haven't.
Reverend Hescott?
Not seen your particular chart, but seen many numbers.
Okay, Dr. Goodman?
The same. I've seen
Same numbers. Okay, you guys got the information. And Mr. Bivens, Dr. Bivens?
No.
And Dr. Smith?
I've not seen the chart, but I've seen the data.
And basically, guys, just to show you, these are 3 organizations. This is their level of mercury exposure. And I apologize to my colleague from Washington for trash your name tag. But the bottom line is here. Here's the World Health Organization. And the vertical axis there, the y-axis is the blood mercury levels at micrograms per liter. European Food Safety Authority, Environmental Protection Agency. You can see that over a 10-year period, we've been under the EPA's limit. Set the standards here, 3.8 milliliters in blood level mercury. One final question. I want to talk to the one representative here who's actually works in the manufacturing industry. This is for you, Mr. Godot. Has the affordability of energy in the United States been a factor in attracting manufacturing in the United States? And will increases in electricity costs due to EPA regulation potentially deter new investment in U.S. manufacturing? Yes or no?
Yes, it will.
Yes. Okay, one more. Are higher energy costs for manufacturers passed on to consumers in the form of higher costs for goods and services?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And final question. You said, and this is a quote, with a 1 cent kilowatt increase in the cost of electricity imposes additional cost of approximately $9 billion per year on factories and manufacturing plants. Will you swallow those costs or pass them on to families and individuals?
Oh, those will be passed on.
Pass them on. Okay, I'm out of time. Thank you all. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Olson. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to begin by, there have been some testimony throughout the day and from comments from the other side that the companies shutting down these plants are doing so to enhance their bottom line and rather than facing up to the reality. So I'd like to introduce into the record some reports that have come from the Bertel Group and others about the cost, the actual cost of introducing.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Please understand where I'm coming from is a coal-fired state. We create coal. We mine coal in West Virginia. 99 or 98% of the power generated in West Virginia is produced by coal. And so when the EPA goes after the coal industry, you're attacking the very fabric, much like you're the Navajo Nation. You're coming at the very fabric of our community. So I'm very sensitive to it, to take it very personally on it. But I think what's happened, because the EPA is truly a group that we have to rely on. How sensible are they going to approach things? And I've learned here in my first year that there's a real credibility gap, and I heard that in the overall discussion here. The numbers that they've been presenting are really subject to question pretty seriously. And if we're making decisions based on false information, it's only going to hurt a state like West Virginia and this nation that's relying on coal fire. So do any of you agree, given the fact that First Energy just spent $1.8 billion on a facility to bring it into compliance for one facility? Is it reasonable to suggest that with the 700 we have across the country, that we're going to be able to do this for $9.4 billion annually? I mean, if any of you think that we can do it for 9.4, let me know. Do any of you agree? I'm not. You think they can do it for 9.4?
If I can explain, then that 9.4 billion is annualized. It's incurred over many, many, many years. And so, in fact, the cost that needs to be spent prior to 2015 to come into compliance is more like 100 billion.
That's going to put a real strain, I think, if we're going to be spending that on all 700 or whatever number that they're going to have with it. But I'm just, and another question: do you agree with the idea that the only reductions, although I showed you that chart, we're only going to reduce less than half of 1% of our energy capacity? Is that reasonable to suggest? That's what they're representing to us, and we're making decisions based on that information. Do any of you agree that it's not going to have an impact on our energy production? And last, Dr. Goodman, let me go to you on a very direct question, because I raised it during the early testimony against with Ms. McCarthy. What about indoor air quality? Because what the Reverend's talking about is providing health for our unborn. What about the indoor air quality? Is that do you agree that the indoor air quality, being in our homes and our offices, is worse than in our playgrounds and parks? Our workplace environment, is that testimony seems to show that, but I'd like to hear it from you, from a toxicologist.
Well, really, my point was more that...
Could you use your mic or speak closer, please?
Sorry. My point was really that in estimating health benefits, the estimates were only based on outdoor concentrations at a fixed point, whereas people don't stand at a fixed point and they spend most of their time indoors. So these calculations don't take into account indoor exposures at all. So we have
but
no
that's
idea.
what they keep testifying to. What are we missing? How can we get them to separate the two so that we can deal with a real problem where we're spending 90% of our life is indoors? How do we deal with that?
well, we need to put the money into conducting studies where we actually measure the indoor exposures and then look at health effects based on people's actual exposures rather than the surrogates for exposure that aren't very precise.
Thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you. At this time, Mr. Pompeo of Kansas, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Roberson, I heard your testimony. Is it fair to say that this new rule is a ban on new coal-fired power plants in effect?
In my view, it is a ban because I don't see how anyone can go forward with a new coal-fired project.
And we talked to you, we're here, I think, when I spoke with Ms. McCarthy about the existing plants. We talked about Logan 1. In fact, there's really no power plant in existence today that can consistently meet the requirements that the new rule would require.
I believe that's correct.
Thank you. Mr. McDonald, when you talk about your electricity rates going up, if rates go up to the level that you have hypothesized, that your data suggests, that the folks have told you, what does that mean on a relative basis to other countries?
Well, we're already seeing imports of steel into the U.S. economy. So what it means is that we will undoubtedly have a competitive pressure against our own domestic production. We'll lose production, which is going to be a loss of jobs. It's a direct interaction.
And electricity costs are a very relevant, very significant portion of the cost of goods sold for those businesses.
That's correct.
Thank you, Mr. Bivens. I'm fascinated by your testimony. I want to make sure I've got it right before I ask you a question. You said that regulatory policy in the long run has no net impact on jobs.
Yes.
And then you also said that one person's costs are someone else's income.
Yes.
So if we had a regulation that caused someone to take a stack of dollar bills, $1 million, and burn them, that would be a cost to that business, correct?
Sure.
And whose income would that be?
Whoever set them on fire, if they got paid for it. It's a weird.
Okay, they got paid $1, so there would be a net loss to if they got paid $1 to burn them. But the $1 million that was burned, that regulation, it's not true that regulations have a one-to-one correlation between cost and income. That regulation would generate $1 million of cost, and if we paid him $3 an hour and it took him an hour to do it, it'd generate $3 of income. So there would be a net loss associated with that regulation. Is that not right?
That's right. But
so it's not so that's right. So
but every bit of compliance costs
income.
are somebody else's income.
Excuse me?
Every bit of compliance costs is somebody else's income.
That was a compliance
No, the
cost.
EPA separates them out, compliance costs versus social costs, and the difference between the two is economic activity foregone. That's what you're talking about, and the vast majority of the total social cost is a compliance cost.
So where did this money go? This regulation required them. Tell me, that was a compliance cost. They were forced to burn the $1 million.
That hypothetical one, the ratio would be different, for sure.
Okay, so if we made somebody build a building and we said no power tools could be used, your answer is no impact on jobs whatsoever.
Actually, that would create jobs because that would be a very inefficient way to do it. It would take a lot more manpower
so the
to get the
cost
building
would far
up.
exceed the benefits associated with that. It's fascinating. Your experience set in running a manufacturing business that has profit and loss responsibility is exactly what?
None.
So your views of this come from books and
looking
learning
at actual economic data.
And data. But you, unlike some of the other folks who are testifying today, haven't actually had responsibility for hiring people and making sure that at the end of the day those checks cleared the bank and that you could grow your business and keep all your stakeholders, your shareholders, your employees, your community, keeping all of them happy. Your sum total experience there is precisely zero.
Manufacturing, that's correct.
Great. Ms. Smith, I want to ask you your views of this notion that regulatory policy has no impact on jobs.
It's simply not possible to spend money on investments that don't increase the productivity of the economy and expect to get a net increase in the economy or even a net zero. It will always have a net drag on the economy if the investment, that is somebody's income and somebody's spending, also doesn't increase the productivity, and that is really what's happening with investments in retrofit controls or more expensive energy.
Indeed, another way to look at Mr. Bivens' economic area is if I sell something to you for $5, it's not a zero-sum game, right? You're happier with the $5, and I'm happier with the product. We both gained from that. It's not the case that there was just an exchange. We created value through trade in that process. Mr. Bivens suggests it's a zero-sum deal, and we're stuck in the new school research beliefs about economic processes.
Correct.
Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Pao. Mr. Griffith of Virginia, recognized for 5 minutes.
I guess my thoughts on the comments of Mr. Pompeo are that, you know, one of the problems that we have in my area where we've lost a lot of jobs is that even if we accept some of the policies of Dr. Bivens, the people who are gaining are not Americans. They're foreign countries that are gaining at our expense because we can no longer make the goods here. We're shipping coal to China and other places so they can make the products that we used to make. So even if I accept some of your principles, it seems to me that what's happening is the gainers are not people who are producing jobs in the United States, they're people in other countries. And one of the concerns I have, and when we look at this chart and you've got, 3%, it looks like 0.3% of global mercury air emissions, and we had this chart up earlier, come from U.S. power plants, according to the EPA. One of the concerns I have is that the facilities that use a lot of electricity that provide jobs in my district and in other districts, Mr. McKinley's district, lots of places where we're heavily dependent on coal, you raise that price, and the estimate from AEP itself, which is the major supplier, although there are others in my district, is 10 to 15% for the consumers. When those jobs go away, there are health impacts on people in my district who no longer have jobs. When that increase in the electricity rate goes up 10 to 15%, there are health impacts on the folks who can't afford to heat their home at the level they want to, who isolate themselves during the wintertime because unlike, and I'm going to mispronounce the name, Tosi? Mr. Tosi, a lot of my folks have been on electricity for quite a while, but they can't afford to pay the bill. They isolate themselves in one room and try to keep the heat to a minimum, not to a healthy level, but to keep the pipes from freezing and to keep themselves from freezing at night. That has a negative impact on health. And when we look at this mercury, I would submit when we ship jobs, because we have made electricity so expensive in this country, we ship jobs to other countries where they'll make the goods with the products that we aren't, with the coal that we're not willing to use any longer. We actually increase, in my opinion, I don't have a study to back it up, but it's common sense tells me if we're shipping that coal to countries to be burned in places where they don't even have the reasonable regulations that we currently have, where they don't have anything to clean up the mercury, and it's in the northern hemisphere, that air is coming back to us. And a NASA study has actually shown us that it takes 10 days for the air from the central part of the Gobi Desert to reach the eastern shore of Virginia. That means that a significant part, and part of the reason you look at this and you're saying, wait a minute, what are we doing? It looks like to me that while we may be trying to positively affect health, we're making some decisions that don't look at the world as a whole, that only look at what's happening in a particular neighborhood. And I guess I would ask, would you agree that we need to look at the whole world situation and make sure that we're not destroying American jobs, which also, by killing those jobs, has a negative health impact? Would you agree with that, Mr. McDonald, that if we're going to make these decisions, we have to do them in a global sense and not just look at the United States?
Absolutely. The term leakage, which was abundantly used during the cap and trade discussions, isn't brought up now, but it's just as important.
And would you explain that to me? I wasn't here for the cap and trade discussions, but I clearly talk about cap and trade all the time.
Leakage is exactly what you're suggesting. If our costs go up here and force the product to be made in a less regulated jurisdiction, the emissions will be higher net globally, and the product production won't happen here. It'll happen somewhere else.
All right. Regrettably, I would probably prefer, and I probably have time to get each one of you to answer that, but I'm going to decline because I also don't like to miss votes on the floor. And if you heard those bells going off about, I don't know how much time we have left, but about 4 or 5 minutes ago, they called for votes on the floor. So I'm going to yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Griffith. Mr. Rush, you wanted to ask a second round, so recognize you for 5 minutes.
I'm going to be quite brief, Mr. Chairman. I know we've got to go for a vote. But I want to, Reverend Haycock saying there's a pretty popular spiritual song around this that says, in effect, please be patient with me. He's not finished with me yet. And I'm sorry that my friend from Illinois is not here, but I kind of have to apologize. And you are our invited witness, and so therefore I have to assume some responsibility for the fact that he threw out some charges, and you didn't have a chance to refute the charges or to address the charges, and then there is a record. So my only, I'm going to offer you an opportunity, either verbally, orally, on the record now, to address the charges, or you, in writing in the future. You can do either. You can choose your option, how you want to deal with that. But I just think that you should have an opportunity to respond to those, I think, pretty unfair and characterizations of you and your motivations and your understanding of this issue.
Well, I can share it in about 1 minute or less. First off, the reason we don't take formal actions on pro-life bills is we are members of the National Association of Evangelicals. We don't take up policy issues on everything because they're not our expertise, so we leave that with our partner, the larger agency, the National Association of Evangelicals. Number one. Number two, you know, for me, and I wish I would have brought my sign, in this year's pro-life march it says, you know, pro-life is anti-abortion and a whole lot more about environmental things. So we have a consistent stream of being life. And I think what I mentioned to Congressman Waxman was true. There is a tremendous growing movement of evangelicals and Roman Catholics across this country who support us, that understand that being pro-life is totally pro-life. Environmental health, anti-poverty, and all those issues. So I thank you, Mr. Rush, for your comments, but I also know that I've been a man of God and have had lots of parking lot conversations as a pastor for 20 years, so I know how it goes. Thank you.
That concludes today's hearing. The record will be kept open for 10 days, and I'm also going to ask that we submit into the record an analysis by David Gwinnett, who's with the Air Toxics Assessment Group at EPA, in which they looked at specifically 2 electric utility steam generating units and the impact that those units had on mercury emissions into a nearby lake and its impact on fish, and they concluded that based on their analysis that the risk associated with those mercury exposures were insignificant. So I put that in the record. Thank all of you very much for joining us this afternoon, and we look forward to working with you as we continue to move forward on these issues. With that, the hearing is adjourned.